Following is a rough translation using Google Translate from the Italian of Una Caro in praise of monogamy, a doctrine of marriage as an exclusive union and mutual belonging, published by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, with the approval of Pope Leo XIV. Presentation. This is a text for the Universal Church, yet it can be duly considered in every place in the face of local cultural challenges. The document, in fact, takes seriously the current global context of the development of technological power, in which human beings are tempted to think of themselves as limitless creatures, capable of achieving whatever they imagine. In this way, the value of an exclusive love, reserved for a single person, is easily obscured, which in itself implies the free renunciation of many other possibilities. In truth, the intention of this note is fundamentally propositional, to extract from the sacred scriptures, from the history of Christian thought, from philosophy, and even from poetry, reasons and motivations that push us to choose a unique and exclusive union of love, a rich and an all-encompassing mutual belonging. This effort will enrich reflection and teaching on marriage with an aspect that has so far been underdeveloped. At the same time, it could provide varied and useful material for marriage movements and groups for study and dialogue. This explains the length of the note and the number of authors and texts cited. Some may find this selection excessive, but we believe that each of the authors and texts cited can provide nuances that stimulate serene reflection and sustained study. We will consider the most important works of the magisterium in a series of authors from ancient to recent times, theologians, philosophers, and poets. We have found a wealth of reflections that emphasize the union of spouses, reciprocity, and the all-encompassing meaning of the marital relationship. Thus, the diverse texts will compose a beautiful mosaic that will surely enrich our understanding of monogamy. If, however, one wishes to grasp only a brief reflective summary to justify the choice of an exclusive union between a single woman and a single man, it will be sufficient to read the last chapter and the conclusion of this note, which focus on the mutual belonging of spouses and on conjugal charity. In any case, we suggest patiently reading the note in its entirety to fully grasp the breadth of the aspects involved in this rich subject. Signed, Víctor Manuel Cardinal Fernández, Prefect. 1. Introduction. Article 1. Una Caro, one flesh, in quotes, is the way the Bible expresses marital unity. In everyday language, however, quote, the two of us, in quotes, is an expression that appears when there is a strong sense of reciprocity in a marriage. That is, the perception of the beauty of an exclusive love, of an alliance between two people who share life in its entirety, with all its struggles and hopes. Quote, the two of us, in quotes, is used when referring to shared desires, sufferings, ideas, and dreams. In a word, when referring to stories that only spouses have experienced. This is a verbal manifestation of something deeper, a conviction, and a decision to belong to each other, to be, quote, one flesh, in quotes, to walk the path of life together. As Pope Francis said, quote, spouses too should form a first-person plural, and we, standing before each other as an I and a you, is standing before the rest of the world, including the children as an us, in quotes. That's from Pope Francis' General Audience on October 23rd, 2024. This happens because although they are two different people, two individualities who each retain their own and non-transferable identity, they have forged with their free consent a union that places them together before the world. It's a union that opens generously to others, but always starting from that unique and exclusive reality of the conjugal us. Article 2. St. John Paul II, speaking of monogamy, maintained that it, quote, deserves to be studied ever more deeply, in quotes. That's from John Paul II's homily at the Mass for Families in Kinshasa on May 3, 1980. His indication of the need for a broader treatment of this theme is one of the motivations that prompted the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith to prepare this doctrinal note. Furthermore, at the origin of this text are, on the one hand, the various dialogues with the bishops of Africa and other continents on the question of polygamy in the context of their ad limina visits. There's a footnote that says the Symposium of Episcopal Conferences of Africa Madagascar, SECAM, has undertaken to draft a report for the Synod of Bishops on the challenges of polygamy. While awaiting this document, it seems appropriate to note that, according to a common opinion, monogamous marriage in Africa should be considered an exceptional fact, given the widespread practice of polygamy in those regions. However, in-depth studies on African cultures show that the different traditions attribute special importance to the first marriage between a man and a woman and, above all, to the role that the first wife is called to play in relation to the other wives. Indeed, research indicates rather that polygamy is a practice tolerated because of the necessities of life, absence of children, levirate labor for survival, etc. Many traditions, in fact, promote the monogamous model as the ideal of marriage that corresponds to divine plans. The first wife, regularly married according to traditional customs, is often presented as the one given to the man by God, although the latter may adopt other women. In the case of polygamy, the first wife is accorded a special place in the performing the sacred ritual funeral rites or in raising children born to the other women in the family. It's interesting to note that in recent decades, in some states, the civil legislature has established monogamy as an ordinary marital regime. There it's referencing Société Africaine de Culture, les religions africaines comme source des valeurs de civilisation, colloque de contrôle from the 16th to 20th of August, 1970, Raisons Africaines, Paris, 1972, Isidore de Souza's Mariage et Famille, and the Revue de l'Institut Catholique de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, 5 through 6, 164, and then also it notes Notion et réalité de la famille en Afrique et dans la Bible, in Savane Forêt, at the end of the footnote. And on the other, the observation that various public forms of non-monogamous union, sometimes called polyamory, are growing in the West, in addition to the more private or secret ones that have been common throughout history. Article 3. But these reasons are subordinate to the first, because properly understood, monogamy is not simply the opposite of polygamy. It is much more, and a deeper understanding of it allows us to conceive of marriage in all its richness and fruitfulness. The issue is intimately linked to the unitive purpose of sexuality, which is not limited to ensuring procreation, but helps to enrich and strengthen the unique and exclusive union in the sense of mutual belonging. Article 4. As the Code of Canon Law itself states, quote, the essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility, in quotes. That's a reference to Canon number 1056. Also references Canon 776-3 of the Eastern Churches. Elsewhere, the same code states that marriage is, quote, a bond which by its nature is perpetual and exclusive, in quotes. That's a reference to Canon 1134, and then it also references the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Article 1638. It is worth noting that there is an abundant bibliography on the indissolubility of the conjugal union in Catholic literature. The theme has had much more space in the magisterium, in particular in the recent teaching of many bishops in the face of the legislation of divorce in various countries. On the unity of marriage, marriage understood that as a unique and exclusive union between one man and one woman, one finds, on the contrary, a less extensive development of reflection than on the theme of indissolubility, both in the magisterium and in manuals dedicated to the subject. Article 5. For this reason, in this text, we have chosen to focus on the property of unity and its existential reflection, the intimate and all-encompassing communion between spouses. Therefore, in order not to expect from this note something that it does not intend to develop, it's necessary to insist that in the pages that follow, it will not deal with marital indissolubility, a union that lasts until death separates Christian spouses, nor with the purpose of procreation. Both themes are abundantly treated in theology and the magisterium. The note will focus only on the first essential property of marriage, unity, which can be defined as the unique and exclusive union between a single woman and a single man, or in other words, as the mutual belonging of the two, which cannot be shared with others. Article 6. This property is so essential and primary that marriage is often defined simply as union, in quotes. Thus, the Summa Theologiae of St. Thomas Aquinas states that, quote, Marriage is the marital union, conjunctio, of man and woman contracted by legitimate persons, which implies an inseparable communion of life, in quotes. That's from the supplement to the Summa Theologiae, being supplement question 44, answer 3, affirms the definition of marriage given by Pietro Lombardo in the sentences 4 D27C2, and it has in Latin, quote, sunt igitur nuptiae vel matrimonium viri mulierosque conjunctio maritalis inter legitimas personas individuum vitae consuetudinem retinens, in quote. That's the translation of what it said in English above. In a footnote, and that, quote, it is evident that in marriage there exists a union by which one is called husband and the other wife, and this union is marriage, in quotes. It's from the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas' supplement, question 44, answer 1. In a footnote, a similar definition has already been found in Justinian, who collected pre-existing opinions, quote, it is the union, conjunctio, man and woman, which contains an inseparable communion of life, in quotes. That's from Justinian's Institutiones 191. Closer to us, Dietrich von Hildebrand maintains that marriage, quote, is the deepest and most intimate union between human persons, in quotes. That's from Dietrich von Hildebrand's The Encyclical Humanae Vitae, Sign of Contradiction, published by Pauline in Rome. Article 7. Already in these classical definitions, we see that the unity of the two spouses as an objective, foundational fact, and essential property of every marriage is called to constant expression and development as a, quote, communion of life, in quotes, that is a conjugal friendship, mutual help, total sharing, which, with the help of grace, increasingly represents another union that transcends and encompasses it, the union between Christ and his beloved bride, the Church, the people of God for whom he gave his blood. That's referencing Ephesians 5:25-32. Article 8. St. John Paul II intimately connects these two aspects. Indeed, if, quote, by virtue of the covenant of conjugal love, man and woman are no longer two but one flesh, there is a reference within this quote from Matthew 19:6 and Genesis 2:24. At the same time, quote, and that's the end of that quote, and then it starts up again. At the same time, quote, they are called to grow continually in their communion, so that every day they progress towards an ever richer union between them at all levels, in quotes. This is from John Paul II's Apostolic Exhortation Familiaris Consortio, Article 19. Article 9. In this note, therefore, we will examine both unity as an essential property and objective and constitutive reality of marriage, the first and founding characteristic of all its manifestations, and the different expressions of that same unity which enrich and strengthen the conjugal alliance, thus making it possible at the same time to perceive this unity not as a monolithic reflection of divine unity, but as an expression of the one God who is the communion in Trinitarian relations. Article 10. Finally, it's hoped that this note on the value of monogamy, intended primarily for bishops, referring to such an important, at the same time very beautiful theme, may be of help to already married couples, engaged couples, and young people thinking of a future union in order to grasp even better the richness of the Christian proposal on marriage. It's true that for many such a message may sound strange or against the current, but we can apply it to the following words of St. Augustine, quote, give me a heart that loves, and it will understand what I say, in quotes. From Augustine's Tractatus number 26 on the Gospel of John. Moreover, a true passion for the beauty of conjugal love has found expression in the dedication of many believers, men and women, clergy and laity, individually or in collegial groups, who have accompanied many couples on their life journey, and have also developed a spirituality and a pastoral approach to marriage. For all these shining examples, we can only express our dutiful thanks. This section is entitled Part 2, Monogamy in the Bible. Article 11, quote, they are no longer two, but one flesh, end quote. That's from Mark 10:8. This declaration of Jesus regarding marriage expresses the beauty of love, a cement which, quote, gives solidity to this community of life, and the impetus which draws it towards an ever more perfect fullness, end quote. That's from Paul VI, Discours au foyer des équipes Notre-Dame on May 4th, 1970. Instituted, quote, at the beginning, in quotes, already at the moment of creation, marriage appears as a conjugal pact willed by God as, quote, a sacrament of the creator of the universe, therefore inscribed in the human being himself, who is oriented towards this path, in which the man abandons his parents, unites himself to his woman, to form one flesh, so the two may become a single existence, end quote. As from Benedict XVI's meeting with the young people of the Diocese of Rome in preparation for the 21st World Youth Day on April 6, 2006. Even if, quote, it is known that the history of the Old Testament is the scene of a systematic defection from monogamy, in quotes. That's from John Paul II's General Audience on August 13th, 1980. Given, for example, the events of the patriarchs, where we read, according to the custom of the time, of characters with more than one wife. There it's referencing 2 Samuel 3, verses 2 through 5, 2 Samuel 11, 2 through 27, 2 Samuel 15, verse 16, and 1 Kings 11, verse 3. At the same time, many passages of the Old Testament celebrate monogamous love and exclusive union. Quote, though the king's wives be 60, the concubines 80, the girls innumerable, but my dove is one, my all, end quote. That's from Song of Songs 6, verses 8 through 9a. This is also attested by the examples of Isaac. There's referencing Genesis 25, verses 19 to 28. Joseph, it's referencing Genesis 41:50. Ruth, it's referencing Ruth chapters 2 through 4. Ezekiel, there's referencing Ezekiel 24, 15 to 18. And Tobias, there's referencing Tobias 8, verses 5 through 8. On the other hand, and from a factual and normative point of view, monogamy does not have solid foundations in the Old Testament. Its theological foundations develop in depth, and this is the fruitful path that will be followed in the following reflections. And then there's a footnote that is referencing the Pontifical Biblical Mission, What is Man? Psalm 8:5, an itinerary of biblical anthropology. This was published on September 30th, 2019. Given the next subsection is called Monogamy in Genesis chapter 2, Article 12. At the root of the monogamous model, chapter 2 of the book of Genesis presents itself as a true anthropological manifesto placed at the incipit of the scriptures. It describes the project that the Creator proposes as the ideal for the freedom of the human creature. The divine exclamation, quote, it's not good that man should be alone, I will make him a helper, Ezer, suitable for him, end quote. That's from Genesis 2:18. Clearly highlights the need in which man finds himself as soon as he emerges from the hands of God, namely a state of solitude, isolation. Despite the presence of other living beings, man wants a helper suitable for him. There's referencing Genesis 2:20, a living ally, unique and personal, whom he can look into the eyes, as suggested by the words kenegdo, usually translated as, quote, similar, in quotes, or corresponding, in quotes, to highlight the need for a dialogical encounter of glances and faces. In fact, quote, the original Hebrew expression refers to a direct, almost frontal, in quotes, relationship, eyes to eyes, and a dialogue that is also tacit, because in love, silences are often more eloquent than words, as the encounter with a face, a you, who reflects divine love and is, quote, here's a quote from scripture within this quote, from Sirach 36:26, the first of all goods, a helper fit for him, and a pillar of support, end quote, as a biblical sage says. And that was all from Pope Francis's exhortation, apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, Article 1, Article 12. Man therefore seeks an irreplaceable face before him, a you, with whom he can weave a true relationship of love, made of giving and reciprocity. Article 13. In his commentary on this passage from Genesis, Benedict XVI states, quote, the first novelty of biblical faith consists in the image of God. The second, essentially connected to it, is found in the image of man. The biblical account of creation speaks of the solitude of the first man, Adam, to whom God wishes to place a helper. Among all creatures, none can be for man the help he needs, although he has given names to all the wild beasts and all the birds, thus integrating them into the context of his life. Then, from one of the man's ribs, God creates the woman. Now Adam finds the help he needs. And then here's a quote. Within that quote, this is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, end quote. That's from Genesis 2:23. And the quote, and Pope Benedict's words continue, The biblical account does not speak of punishment. The idea, however, that man is in some way incomplete constitutionally on the way to finding in the other the integral part of his entirety, the idea that he can become complete only in communion with the other sex is certainly present, end quotes. And that's from Benedict XVI's encyclical Deus Caritas S from December 25th, 2005, Article 11. Article 14. The conclusion of the biblical story, quote, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined, davak, to his wife, and they will become one flesh, end quotes, that's from Genesis 2:24, expresses well this need for an intimate union, such a physical and interior attachment that the psalmist uses it to describe the mystical union with God. Quote, my soul clings to you, davak, end quotes. That's from Psalm 63:8, and it's also referenced by 1 Corinthians 6:16-17. As Pope Francis states, quote, the verb to cling in the original Hebrew indicates a close harmony, a physical and interior adhesion, to the point that it's used to describe union with God. And the quote is, my soul clings to you, from Psalm 63:8, sings the persons praying. Thus, the marital union is evoked not only in its sexual and corporal dimension, but also in its voluntary gift of love. The fruit of this union is to, quote, become one flesh, end quotes, both in the physical embrace and in the union of the two hearts and of life, and perhaps in the child who will be born from the two, who will carry within himself, uniting them both genetically and spiritually, the two fleshes, end quotes. And then that's the end of the whole quote from Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, Article 13. With the formula una caro, the reciprocal and total donation of the couple becomes an exclusive and integral relationship. Therefore, with the suggestive term of isha applied to the woman, as referencing Genesis 2:23, the sacred author wanted to remember that these two people constitute a couple equal in their radical dignity, but different in their individual identity. The fullness of the union between human beings is in this equality made of necessary, dialogical, and complementary reciprocity. Ultimately, according to the Creator's original plan, to which Jesus himself refers using the expression, quote, in the beginning, in quotes, in his commentary on the indissolubility of marriage, referencing Matthew 19:4, a man and a woman are called in marriage to a unique, personal, full, and lasting relationship, to an exclusive covenant of life and love, which takes precedence over the social bond of blood, which referencing Genesis 2:24. From this perspective, the application of the nuptial metaphor to God's relationship with Israel, which merges with all its force in the prophetic text, opens an even richer horizon for understanding the life of spouses and as a mutually belonging. The next subsection is prophetic wedding symbolism. Article 15. In the prophets, the categories of conjugal love give particular features to the understanding of the alliance between God and his people, no longer modulated according to the canon of pax between the king and vassal princess. Article 16. Here, the personal story of the prophet Hosea, 8th century BC, emerges in an emblematic way, which is taken as a theological paradigm for rereading the love story between the Lord and Israel. It's referencing Hosea 2:4-25. Despite the betrayal suffered by his wife Gomer, he cannot extinguish his love for her, and instead nurtures the hope that she, abandoned and disappointed by her lovers, will return, in quotes, on the way home in order to fully restore their love relationship, since that woman is the only one in his life forgiving her for her betrayals. There is referencing Hosea 2:16-17. Article 17. This symbolic nuptial transposition of divine fidelity will continue in the prophetic tradition with different emphases. Ezekiel recounts how God cares for his people like a man spreading his cloak over a woman. That's referencing Ezekiel 16:8. On the one hand, this gesture indicates the marital pact in which the protection is offered to the wife. On the other, it aims to shield the woman from the gaze of others, thus evoking the exclusivity of the bond. Article 18. The prophet Malachi condemns the breaking of marital ties among members of Israel and remarriage to pagan women. Quote, for I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and anyone who covers his garment with iniquity, says the Lord of hosts. End quote. Says from Malachi 2:16. This passage has also had another interpretation called cultic or typological, as if it referred to a single perversion, idolatry, placing an implicit parallel between profaning the covenant with God and deceiving one's spouse, adultery. Article 19. Ultimately, conjugal love truly allows us to describe a dialectic of covenant between Israel and the Lord, between humanity and God. The idea of God as Israel's sole husband is also linked to that of Israel as its sole bride. The uniqueness of the beloved is also evident in the theme of election, which makes Israel the sole chosen people. There's referencing Amos 3:2. The covenant thus takes on a further dimension in that it designates the bond between God and his people based on a monogamous bond so real that the worship of another God constitutes adultery. Article 20. St. John Paul II offers in this regard a beautiful synthesis. Quote, in many texts, monogamy appears to be the only and correct analogy of monotheism understood in the categories of the covenant, that is, of fidelity and trust in the one and true God, Yahweh, the husband of Israel. Adultery is the antithesis of that spousal relationship. It's the antinomy of marriage, also as an institution, in that monogamous marriage brings into effect in itself the interpersonal alliance between man and woman. It realizes the alliance born of love and accepted by both respective parties precisely as marriage, and as such, recognized by society. This type of alliance between two people constitutes the foundation of that union whereby, quote, the man shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. End quote. So it's from Genesis 2:24, and that whole quote was from St. John Paul II's General Audience on August 27, 1980. The next subsection is called Wisdom Literature. All wisdom literature that praises monogamous union, and this is Article 21, all wisdom literature that praises monogamous union as the true expression of love between a man and a woman follows the same line. The passage from the Song of Songs, quote, my beloved is mine and I am his, end quote, so it's from Song of Songs 2:16, represents a true pinnacle here. In this poetic jewel, the woman of the song expresses her love using the symbol of the seal that is in the ancient Near East designated as a person, identified them with and was worn either on a bracelet or on a chain around the chest. Quote, set me as a seal upon your heart and upon your arm. Love is as strong as death. End quote. This is from Song of Songs 8:6. The beloved therefore declares that she is almost her man's identity card, in quotes. One does not exist without the other and vice versa. Intelligence, will, affection, action, and the entire personality of one communicate in the other in a reciprocal and exclusive way, in full symbiosis. Death rises in vain against this vital unity. Article 22. Furthermore, the affirmation repeated twice in the Song of Songs, quote, my beloved is mine and I am his, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine, in quotes. That's from Song 2:16 and Song of Songs 6:3, expresses this unity of total giving, of reciprocity, and of mutual belonging, as a re-edition of the declaration of love addressed by the man to his woman in Genesis 2:23, quote, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, in quotes. Article 23. The Jewish and Christian traditions, especially in mysticism, have agreed in interpreting the Song of Songs as an allegory of the covenant between God and Israel, of the relationship between God and the soul. In a symbolic sense, it could be said that the book of the Song of Songs exalts the love of a man and a woman by placing the accent precisely on the uniqueness of an exclusive relationship. In the love story, the two lovers seek and desire each other with a reciprocity in which there is no room for a third party. This fundamental anthropological fact refers back to Israel's profession of faith. Quote, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, in quotes. That's from Deuteronomy 6:4. This is one of the most solemn proclamations of God in the Old Testament, and it's a proclamation that uses the language of uniqueness when professing the truth of faith. In other words, the Song of Songs affirms that at the heart of one of the most profound anthropological experiences, such as the loving relationship, there's a uniqueness analogous to that which faith proclaims about God. Therefore, monogamy is profoundly connected to the uniqueness and exclusivity of the God of Israel and goes hand in hand with monotheism. Article 24. In this regard, Benedict XVI states, quote, God used the way of love to reveal the intimate mystery of his Trinitarian life. Furthermore, the close relationship that exists between the image of God as love and human love allows us to understand that, and there's a quote within the quote, monogamous marriage corresponds to the image of the monotheistic God. Marriage based on an exclusive and definitive love becomes the icon of God's relationship with his people and vice versa. God's way of loving becomes the measure of human love. End of that quote within the quote, and Pope Benedict continues, this indication still remains largely to be explored. Ends of the whole quote, and the footnote has Benedict XVI's address on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the foundation of the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family from May 11, 2006. And within that quote, he was referencing Pope Benedict's, his own encyclical Deus Caritas S, Article 11. Article 25, I'm going to repeat it, sorry. The double formula, quote, my beloved is mine and I am his, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine, end quote, that's from Song of Songs 2:16 and 6:3. Therefore recalls the theological formula of the covenant between God and biblical Israel. Quote, the Lord is your God and you are his people, end quote, so that's from Deuteronomy 7:6. And allows us to access the theological category of the covenant as a mutual commitment of fidelity. The biblical category of the covenant allows us, finally, to outline the sanctity of marriage between husband and wife and its expression of a true community of life and love through a mutual and exclusive gift. All this will become fully evident in the text of the New Testament. There's a footnote referencing Gaudium et Spes, Article 48, and Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, Article 67. The next subsection is the wedding symbolism of the New Testament, Article 26. In the Gospel, Jesus explicitly refers, quote, to the beginning, in quotes, that is, to the origins of the first human couple. There, he's referencing Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, to reiterate that monogamous, faithful, and indissoluble love exalts the relationship of the couple conceived by the Creator in a dimension of totality and exclusivity. And then that's all referencing Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9. Article 27. In the Gospel narratives of Mark and Matthew, Jesus expressed himself unequivocally on monogamy, referring to the origins to the will of the Creator. The debate with the Pharisees on the possibility of divorce offers him the opportunity to make an authoritative pronouncement. He reaffirms the principle of monogamy, which is the foundation of God's plan for the family. Quote, from the beginning of creation, and then Jesus is quoting, quote, God made them male and female, end quote, from the book of Genesis. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined, let no man separate. End of the quote from Jesus from Mark 10, 6 through 9. And then it references the other synoptic gospel that has this, Matthew 19, 4 through 6. As the basis of his statement, Jesus combines two weighty exegetical elements. Quote, he made them male and female, in quotes, that's from Genesis 1:27. And, quote, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, in quotes. This is from Genesis 2:24. The first man and the first woman are therefore united by God himself in the one flesh couple. In other words, Jesus restores validity to God's original plan, goes beyond the norm given by Moses, and recalling an older one, while at the same time underlying a divine presence at the very root of this relationship. Quote, what God has joined together, let no man separate, in quotes. This is from Matthew 19:6. Article 28. Furthermore, the New Testament, in the wake of prophetic theology, repeatedly introduces nuptial symbolism into Christological and ecclesiological themes. There it's referencing Revelation 19, verses 7 through 9. Christ is called by the Baptist the bridegroom par excellence. There's referencing John 3:29. Well, the bride of the Lamb is the New Jerusalem. There's referencing Revelation 21, verse 1 and following. A fertile mother saved from the attack of the dragon, which referencing Revelation 12, 3 through 6. Article 29. St. Paul systematically develops the theme of full and perfect marital love between Christ and the Church in his letter to the Ephesians, as referencing Ephesians 5:21-23, taking up, among other things, the passage from Genesis about the couples being one flesh, referencing Genesis 2:24. The indissoluble monogamous love between the two spouses, always in line with the theme developed by the prophets to define the covenant between the Lord and Israel, reveals itself as the symbol describing the bond between Christ and the Church. Christian marriage in its authenticity and fullness is therefore a sign of the new Christian covenant. Article 30. The formula of the, quote, great mystery, in quotes, also deserves attention as a translation of the original Greek mysterion. This was rendered by St. Jerome in the Vulgate with the term sacramentum, which allowed ecclesial tradition to adopt the Pauline formula as an explicit proclamation of the sacramentality of marriage. The passage in its entirety intensely exalts the theological function performed by exclusive nuptial love. The two spouses who unite indissolubly are a sign that refers to the embrace which Christ draws from the Church to himself, with which Christ draws the Church to himself. Christian spouses therefore bear witness in the world not only by to a human bond, eros and agape, but are also the living image of a sacred and transcendent bond that is the one that unites Christ with the community of Christians. Already in Genesis, the couple who love and generate were defined as the image of the Creator God. Quote, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. In quotes. That's Genesis 1:27. Article 31. The apostle, evoking above all the passage from Genesis, in which the two, man and woman, form one flesh, there's reference to Genesis 2:24, defines the intimacy of love between husband and wife as a luminous emblem of the communion of life and charity that exists between Christ and the church. It's referencing Ephesians 5:32. Through this passage from the letter to the Ephesians, so fragrant in its humanity but also so dense in its theological quality, Paul does not limit himself to proposing a model of Christian marital behavior, but indicates the perfect and unique union between Christ and the church as the original source of monogamous marriage. It's not only an image of that union, but reproduces and embodies it through the love of the spouses. It's an effective and expressive sign of the grace and love that substantiate the union between Christ and the church. Article 32. Finally, we find a beautiful exhortation in the letter to the Hebrews. After the appeal to charity, there's referencing Hebrews 13:1-3, the author briefly treats marriage, recommending esteem for this bond, and respect for conjugal fidelity. Quote, let marriage be held in high regard by all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. End quote. That's from Hebrews 13:4. And there's a footnote that says, in Greek, timios ogamos en pasin ke kiti amiandos. Hebrews 13:4. The author exhorts us to hold the institution of marriage in honor, underlining the value of faithful conjugal relations. A solemn warning is added. God will judge fornicators and adulterers, that is, those who do not respect the sanctity and the uniqueness of marriage. The exhortation to esteem marriage and the conjugal bed was historically motivated by the fact that various ascetic tendencies denigrated this institution and saw it as a compromise with matter, repeating in their own way what is expressed in Colossians 2:20-23. The exhortation, however, is not directed against sexual relations, but against those who denied the fidelity of spouses and the uniqueness of marriage. Part 3. Echoes of Scripture and History. The revealed word is Article 33. The revealed word contained in the sacred scriptures has produced, over the long history of the church, various echoes that we will try to gather, at least in part. Then a subsection is Some Reflections by Christian Theologians. Article 34. It's useful to welcome the richness of Christian thought throughout the centuries, starting from the fathers of the church with their particular importance, up to theologians of different schools and orientations. And then a subsection of this section is Early Developments on Marital Unity and Communion in the Church Fathers. Article 35. St. John Chrysostom recognizes a particular value in marital unity. Unlike other fathers, he maintains that, quote, once marriage has had two motives, now it has only one, end quotes. He explains, in fact, that St. Paul, referencing 1 Corinthians 7:2-5-9, quote, commands them to unite, not so that they may become fathers of many children, end quotes, and then it keeps going, but because of this leads spouses to, quote, the abolition of debauchery and unbridled desire, end quotes. That's from John Chrysostom's De Virginitate 19. Ultimately, the Holy Doctor considers that the unity of marriage, with the choice of a single person to whom one is united, leads to the liberation of persons from unbridled sexual outbursts without love or fidelity, and gives adequate direction to sexuality. Article 36. St. Augustine, while emphasizing above all the importance of procreation, emphasizes first and foremost the good of unity, which is expressed in fidelity. Quote, fidelity requires not having sexual relations with another man or woman, in quotes. That's from Augustine's De Genesi ad Litteram, Book 9, Chapter 7, number 12. Augustine was also able to express the beauty of conjugal unity as a good in itself, described dynamically as walking together, side by side, in quotes. Quote, the first natural bond of human society is that between man and woman. And God did not produce each of the two separately, joining them together as strangers, but created one from the other, and the side of the man from which the woman was taken and formed indicates the strength of their union. For side by side are joined those who walk together and who together look to the same goal. In quotes. This is from Augustine's De Bono Coniugali 1:1. Article 37. Even before Augustine, Tertullian's praise of marriage, understood as a unity in the flesh and in the spirit of the two who walk, quote, in one hope, end quotes, was well known. Quote, how shall I be capable of expounding the happiness of that marriage with which the Church unites? What a yoke that of two believers united in one hope, in one observance, in one servitude. They are both brothers and both serve together. There is no division as to the spirit and as to the flesh. Indeed, they are truly one, two in one flesh, and where the flesh is one, there is one spirit. End quotes. This is from Tertullian's Ad Uxorum, Book 2, 8, 6 through 7. And then it has CCSL 1393 as cited in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 1642. The footnote continues. It's noted in the margin that Tertullian treated the theme of monogamy in a specific work, De Monogamia. Furthermore, another father who directly addressed the subject is Jerome. There's referencing Epistola 123 ad Geruchiam de Monogamia. End of footnote 26. Article 38. This fact of being one flesh is interpreted by the fathers in an intensely realistic way, to the point that, faced with contradictions in the facts of the reality of conjugal unity, they do not fear to pronounce affirmations such as the following, quote, he divides his flesh, he divides his body, end quotes. It's from Ambrose's Expositio Evangelii Secundum Lucam, Book 8, 7. Quote, as the wickedness of cutting his flesh, end quotes. It's from John Chrysostom's Commentary on Matthew, Homily 62, 2. Quote, God did not want the body to be divided and destroyed, end quotes. That's from Lectentius Divinae Institutiones, Book 4, 23. Article 39. In any case, it must be remembered that the Latin Church particularly emphasized the juridical aspects of marriage, which have led to the beautiful conviction that the spouses themselves are ministers of the sacrament. There it's a footnote referencing Pius XII's encyclical Mystici Corporis Christi from June 29th, 1943, and it has this quote in Latin: Matrimonio enim quos sposus sibi in vicem sunt ministeri gratiae, externo Christianis consortionis providetur ordinataque increment. End quote. I think it's from article either 35 or 202. It's hard to tell with the citation. End of footnote. With their consent, they give rise to the unique and exclusive marital union, an objective fact prior to any experience or feeling, even spiritual. The Eastern Fathers and the Eastern Churches emphasize more the theological, mystical, and ecclesial aspects of the union, which, thanks to the blessing of the Church, is enriched over time under the impulse of grace, while the communion between the spouses is ever more integrated into ecclesial communion. This is why in the East, the rite of marriage, with all its signs, the prayer, and the gestures of the priest, has been given greater value. Already, St. John Chrysostom speaks of the coronation of the spouses, Stephanoma, performed by the priest, and explains its mystagogical meaning. Quote, for this reason, crowns are placed on their heads as a symbol of victory, since having remained undefeated, they reach the marriage bed. End quotes. That's from John Chrysostom's homily on the first epistle to Timothy, homily 9, chapter 2. And then there's a footnote. The International Theological Commission has tried to welcome the view of the e-Christianese by explaining that it is necessary to avoid that the value of the consent of the spouses, quote, makes the sacrament a pure and solemn emanation of their love. The sacrament as such belongs totally to the mystery of the Church, into which they are introduced in a privileged way by their conjugal love, end quotes. This is from the International Theological Commission, the Catholic Doctrine on the Sacrament of Matrimony, 1977. The 16 Christological Theses of Gustave Martelet S.I. approved, quote, in generic form, end quotes, by the International Theological Commission, Thesis 10. End of footnote. Article 40. At the same time, a more positive vision of the relational aspect prevails in the East, which is also expressed in sexual union and marriage, without reducing its purpose to procreation alone. This is demonstrated, for example, when St. Clement of Alexandria takes a strong distance from those who consider marriage a sin, even when they tolerate it in order to ensure the prolongation of the species. Instead, he reiterates, quote, if marriage according to the law is a sin, I do not know how anyone could say they know God when they affirm that God's commandment is a sin. No, if the law is holy, in quotes, marriage is holy, in quotes. That's from Clement of Alexandria, Stromata 3:12. He's citing Romans 7:12 there. End of footnote. Furthermore, for St. John Chrysostom, marriage, quote, is not to be considered a purchase and a sale, but a communion of life, end quotes. That's from John Chrysostom's Quales ducende sint uxores 3. And he underlines that exaggerated continence in marriage could put marital unity at risk. Article 41. Conjugal unity and communion is a reflection of the union between Christ and the Church, that is referencing Ephesians 5:28-30, is a theme particularly emphasized by the Eastern Fathers, and St. Gregory of Nazianzus draws concrete spiritual consequences from it. Quote, it's good for the wife to respect Christ through a husband, and it's good for the husband not to despise the church through his wife. Let the husband also take care of his wife, and in fact, Christ takes care of the church, in quotes. That's from Gregory of Nazianzus, Oration number 37:7. Then there's another subsection, some medieval and modern authors. Article 42. The thought of St. Bonaventure on marriage, substantially homogeneous with that of St. Thomas, which will be discussed later, we can identify a reflection within the framework of a theological vision, which includes the necessity of consummation so that marriage can fully signify the union between us and Christ. Quote, since consent as consent on future action is not properly consent, but rather a promise of it, and since consent in truth before carnal union does not produce a full union, given that they are not yet one flesh, it follows that through the words about the future, it is said that the marriage has begun, as ratified with words referring to the present, but consummated in carnal union, because then they are one flesh and become one body, and with this the union which is between us and Christ is fully signified. Then, in fact, the body of one is fully given to the body of the other, in quotes. As for Bonaventure's Breviloquium 6:13-3. Article 43. It is also useful to recall the theological pastoral approach of St. Alphonsus Maria de Liguori, who presents the union of and mutual gift of spouses in an integral way, including sexual relations, presenting them as essential intrinsic ends, which considering procreation as an intrinsic but accidental end, while considering procreation as an intrinsic but accidental end. Therefore, he maintains that, quote, the three ends can be considered in marriage: essential intrinsic ends, accidental intrinsic ends, and extrinsic accidental ends. The essential intrinsic ends are two: the mutual gift with the obligation to satisfy the debt, i.e. sexual relations, and the indissoluble bond. The accidental intrinsic ends are equally two: the generation of offspring and the remedy of concupiscence, in quotes. That's from A.M. de Liguori, Theologia Moralis, Editio Nova Leonardo Guardi. It is from Book 6, Tractatus 6, Chapter 2, Dubio 1, number 882. Article 44. St. Alphonsus also refers to the intrinsic ends such as pleasure, beauty, and many others which are illicit. There is a footnote to the same work, number 882, quote, on the other hand, there can be many extrinsic accidental ends such as the achievement of peace, the pursuit of pleasure, etc., in quotes. And this way, the holy doctor of the Church tries to enrich the vision of marriage in order to develop a pastoral approach that helps spouses to live their union in a richer and more stimulating way. It's permitted to desire marriage also on the basis of a particular attraction to one of these intrinsic ends, because as long as the principal ends are not excluded, this, quote, is not a disorder, in quotes. That's from the same work, but Article 883. Article 45. Closer to our times, the theologian and personalist philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand takes up the emphasis on the centrality of love and marriage given by the teaching of Pope Pius XI in order to deepen the understanding of the properties and meanings of marriage itself. There's referencing Dietrich von Hildebrand's Marriage, translated and edited by B. Magnino. With respect to the topic in question, he distinguishes two forms of union which complement each other and enrich the initial approach of this document. The first form of union is expressed with the pronoun we, the second with the pair I-U. In the I-U, the two find themselves face to face. They give themselves to each other in such a way that, quote, the other person acts entirely as a subject, never as a mere object, in quotes. That's from Metaphysik der Gemeinschaft. And I think it's from his longer work from Hildebrand. This also involves the passage from considering the other as a he to one which comes to recognize him as a you. Instead, when the union is considered as an us, the other is with me, as at my side, walking together, motivated by the common things that unite us, which is referencing the same work, but page 45. The marital union lives on both experiences. Article 46. In the marital union, von Hildebrand highlights two essential attitudes. The first is discretio, that is a space of personal intimacy that preserves the identity and freedom of each, which can be shared by a completely free decision, and in this case leads to a deepening of the bond. The second attitude is reverence for the other, which manifests particularly in sexual union, the fact that one loves a sacred, inviolable person, not just any object. The internal dynamism of the marital bond, the we, according to von Hildebrand's categories, impels spouses to increasingly manifest their intimate personal communion. Article 47. This vision is also shared by Alice von Hildebrand, née Jourdain, Dietrich's wife. In particular, she maintains that the full realization of humanity can only be achieved in the union between man and woman, the, quote, divine invention, in quotes. Quote, not only did he, God, make man composed of soul and body, a spiritual and material reality, but in addition to this, to crown this complexity, male and female, he created them. Clearly, the fullness of human nature is found in the perfect union between man and woman, in quotes. That's from Alice von Hildebrand's Man and Woman, A Divine Invention, Sapienza Press, Ave Maria, Florida. I think it's page 8 in the intro or preface. Therefore, spousal love between man and woman is considered by the Belgian philosopher and theologian as the pinnacle of human vocation, the supreme expression of the divine image as a call to the gift of self and love, where the tenderness of affection between the two plays a fundamental role desired by the Creator himself. Quote, the heart is the center of the person, in quotes. It's from Alice von Hildebrand's page, but on page 58 of that document, same one. Lorenz von Hildebrand, faced with certain temptations to put activism before the receptivity of love, understood precisely in an effective sense. She then adds that, quote, where tenderness reigns, concupiscence moves away, in quotes. That's from same work, but page 10. Article 48. The character of total self-giving of spousal love can also be seen in what she characterizes as a true sacrificial, in quotes, dimension of love, with an evident reference to Christ's love, quote, to the end, in quotes, which consists in putting the good of the other before one's own, in what can be called a death to oneself, which on some occasions could even lead to renouncing the joys of a family life for the sake of a greater good. Quote, what many lovers forget, whether we're speaking of friends or of husband and wife, is that sacrifice is the lifeblood of great loves. The sacrifice is the holy vitamin of love. Also applies to marriage, which offers spouses innumerable occasions to die to themselves, in quotes. That's from that same work from Alice von Hildebrand, but pages 135 to 136. In other words, this means that spousal love shows its fruitfulness, both human and spiritual, when it remains open to the highest demands of charity. That's a reference to Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, Article 181. The next subsection is the development of theological vision in recent times. Article 49. Hans Urs von Balthasar assigns particular importance to the marital consent that creates the unity that transcends the two individuals. Quote, the coming together of the two people thus disposed by themselves is possible only in a third element, which is that objective factor that is composed of their two freedoms, their vow, their solemn promise, in which each gives definitive assent to the freedom of the other and to his mystery, and delivers himself to this mystery. It's a reality that must be called objective only because it is more than the juxtaposition of their two subjectivities, their will made one to belong to each other, which places itself above them and between them, because neither of the two can claim for himself the unity that has arisen. In quotes. This is from Hans Urs von Balthasar's Pneuma and Institution, in Spirit and Institution, Theological Essays 4, page 232. Article 50. This pact, where each of the two transcends himself and surrenders to the new reality that is created, is in no way a denial of themselves as free individuals. It's instead a fullness of freedom that is achieved in giving oneself totally to another person. Quote, the event of giving oneself in mutual possession, which is accomplished only under the vault spread over them by the spirit of love that guides and inspires them, is anything but an alienation of self on the part of the individual. The latter does not draw himself except by virtue of the call of the other freedom, which gives him the capacity to resolve to decide his own, and this resolution becomes mature, of age, in quotes, precisely when he does not continue to recover with hesitation, but concentrates himself, collects himself to give himself once and for all, in quotes. This is from the same work of von Balthasar, but pages 236 to 237. Article 51. This author contemplates in a particular and theologically profound way how this marital unity reflects the union between Christ and his church. Quote, the measure of marital love becomes the love between Christ and his church. The original unity consists in this, that the church is born from Christ, as Eve was from Adam. She sprang from the pierced side of the Lord, sleeping on the cross in the shadow of death and hell. For this reason, she is his body, as Eve was flesh from Adam's flesh. In this mortal sleep of the passion, and there's a quote from Ephesians within this longer quote from von Balthasar, quote, formed for himself the church, a marvelous bride without wrinkle or blemish, of that quote, Ephesians 5:24 to 27. He himself, as a man, allows himself to fall into the sleep of death, so that, like God, he can mysteriously draw from the dead that fruitfulness from which he will create his bride, the church. Thus she is he himself, and yet she is not he himself. She is his body and his bride. Quote, he who loves his wife loves himself. No one ever hates his own flesh. He protects and cherishes it. So also Christ does with his church, because we are members of his body, in quotes. Within that quote, Ephesians 5:28 to 30. That's the end of the whole quote from Hans von Balthasar, The States of Life of the Christian, Jaka Book, Milan, 2017, pages 202 to 203. Article 52. Such a Christological and pneumatological vision has concrete consequences on the marital experience. Quote, if you return to cast a glance at the mutual dedication of the spouses, it shows clearly once again that the common law of their love, in the Christological sense, flows both from their own attitude of voluntary self-possession, and therefore is not a law imposed from the outside, as it really arises, surpassing both, is a third, fruitful, creative entity in the pneumatological sense. It inspires them to the acts of their dedication, in quotes. That's from Hans von Balthasar's Pneuma and Institution, page 234. Article 53. Karl Rahner also thinks of marital unity as an expression of the love between Christ and the church, but not as if Christ and the church were equal before each other, since the love with which Christ loves the church has its origin in the, quote, merciful will of God to communicate himself, end quotes. This is from Karl Rahner's Schriften zur Theologie, Band 8, Benziger, page 539. From this will, as cause, springs the first effect, which is the unity of Christ and the church. Ultimately, love, as it is expressed in the life of the spouses, reaches its origin in God himself. It's referencing Karl Rahner's On Marriage, page 10. It is useful to reflect on two texts of Rahner's that are sufficiently eloquent. The first, quote, in truly personal love, there is implicit something unconditional that goes beyond and above the causality of the meeting of lovers. When they truly love, they continually grow above themselves. They reach a flow that no longer has its point of arrival in the finite and the determinable, but lies in an infinite distance, which is silently evoked in such love, can ultimately be called by only one name, God. In quotes. This is from Karl Rahner's On Marriage as well. Same place. And the second text, quote, marriage and the bond between God and humanity in Christ can only be compared with each other by us, but rather can not only be compared with each other by us, but rather they are objectively in a reciprocal relationship such that marriage objectively represents this love that God has in Christ for the church. The relationship and behavior of Christ with the church prefigures the relationship and behavior that exists in marriage and finds its completion in it, so that it includes marriage in itself as a moment of itself, in quotes. That's from Karl Rahner's Church and Sacraments, page 106. Article 54. The Christological Trinitarian perspective on marital unity has been strongly and poetically emphasized by several contemporary Orthodox authors. We give 3 examples. Article 55. Starting from his own mystical vision, the Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann states, quote, in a Christian marriage, in fact, there are three married people, and the united loyalty of the two to the third, who is God, keeps the two in an active unity with each other and with God. However, it's precisely the presence of God that marks the end of marriage as something purely natural, in quotes. It is the cross of Christ that puts an end to the self-sufficiency of nature. But, quote, with the cross, joy has entered the whole world, in quotes. His presence is therefore the true joy of marriage, end of the whole quote. That's from Alexander Schmemann's The Life of the World, Sacraments and Orthodoxy, pages 90 to 91. Article 56. Another beautiful testimony is found in the following words of the Russian philosopher and theologian Pavel Evdokimov. Article, quote, the consubstantial unity of marriage constitutes the unity of two persons who are placed in God. Therefore, the initial Trinitarian structure is man, woman, and the Holy Spirit. The effective realization of their unity in marriage, where the husband, according to Paul, is the image of Christ and the wife is the image of the church, becomes the conjugal equivalent of the Christ-Spirit unity. In quotes. It's from Evdokimov's Marriage, the Sacrament of Love, translated by El Marino, page 165. Article 57. Finally, it's worth quoting an enlightened passage from the theologian John Meyendorff. Quote, a Christian is called already in this world to experience a new life, to become a citizen of the kingdom, and he can do so in marriage. It's a singular union of two beings in love, two beings who can transcend their own humanity and thus be united not only, quote, with each other, in quotes, but also in Christ, in quotes. And that's the end of that quote. That's from Meyendorff's Marriage and Orthodox Perspective, page 16. Article 58. The Eastern authors of our time also insist on the relational aspect in the light of the Trinity. The Greek theologian Ioannis Zizioulas stated that, quote, the person is otherness and communion in otherness. The person is an identity that emerges through the relationship, schesis in the terminology of the Greek fathers. It's an I that can exist only as long as it relates to a you, who affirms its existence and its otherness. The I cannot simply be without the other. This is what distinguishes the person from the individual, in quotes. This is from Zizoulas' Communion and Otherness, translated and edited by M. Campatelli, page 11. In the context of this particular Eastern evaluation of the relationship, which is ultimately a reflection of Trinitarian communion, the other Greek theologian and philosopher, Christos Yanaras, shows how married life must be understood in the broader framework of relationships in the ecclesial community, which allows us to understand sexuality as a personal relationship transfigured by Trinitarian grace. Quote, the relationship and knowledge between spouses become ecclesial events that are brought about not only through nature, but also through the church, within the context of the relationships that hold the church together as an image of the Trinitarian model, end quotes. That's from Yanares' The Freedom of Ethos, pages 164 and following. And this immediately explains that, quote, this does not mean spiritualization of marriage and devaluation of the natural relationship, but a dynamic transformation of the natural impulse into an event of personal communion according to the way in which the church brings about communion, that is, as a grace-free gift of otherness and personal freedom, end quote. That's from the same place in Yanares' The Freedom of Ethos. The next larger section is called Magisterial Interventions, and then the first subsection is called First Interventions. Article 59. Until Leo XIII, the interventions referring to monogamy were few and essential. Worth mentioning is a brief but important intervention by Innocent III in the year 1201, in which he refers to pagans who, quote, share conjugal affection with several women at the same time, end quotes. And with reference to Genesis, he states that it is contrary to the Christian faith, quote, since from the beginning one rib was changed into one woman, end quotes. This is from Innocent III's letter Gaudemus in Domino, from 1201. He then refers to Scripture, referencing Ephesians 5:31, Genesis 2:24, and Matthew 19:5, to underline that it says that, quote, they will be two in one flesh, in quotes. That's duo in carne una. And that the man will unite himself to his wife, in quotes, not to his wives, in quotes. Finally, he interprets the prohibition of adultery, and this referencing Matthew 19:9, and Mark 10:11 as referring to a monogamous marriage. And that's the end of that. It's all a reference to that same letter from Innocent III. Article 60. The Second Council of Lyon again maintains that it is, quote, held as firm that it is not permitted for a man to have more than one wife at the same time, nor for a woman to have more than one son. For a woman to have more than one son. In quotes. This is from Second Council of Lyon, Sessions 4, July 6, 1274, Profession of Faith of the Emperor Michael VIII Palaeologus. The Council of Trent derives the meaning of monogamy from the fact that Christ the Lord taught more openly that with this bond, only two people are closely united when he said, quote, therefore they are no longer two but one flesh, in quotes. It's from the Council of Trent, session number 24, November 11th, 1563, the Doctrine on the Sacrament of Matrimony. In the 18th century, Benedict XIV, taking into consideration the situation of clandestine marriages, reiterates that, quote, neither of the two can, as long as the other is alive, move on to another marriage, in quotes. From Benedict XIV's Declaration Matrimonia Quae in Locis, from November 4th, 1741, number 2. Then there's a subsection called Leo XIII. Article 61. On the subject of monogamy, the central argument that spouses constitute one flesh, in quotes, returns in the teaching of Leo XIII. Quote, we see this declared and solemnly ratified by the gospel with the divine authority of Jesus Christ, who proclaimed to the Jews and the apostles that marriage by its very institution must be between two only, that is, between a man and a woman, and the two are formed as one flesh, end quote. That's from Leo XIII's encyclical Arcanum Divinae Sapientiae, February 10th, 1880. It looks like it is either Article 12 or Articles 386 to 387, with emphasis added. Article 62. In this reflection, the defense of monogamy is equally a defense of the dignity of women, which cannot be denied or dishonored even by the desire for procreation. The unity of marriage therefore implies a free choice by the woman, who has the right to demand exclusive reciprocity. Quote, nothing was more miserable than the wife lowered to such vileness that she was almost considered only as an instrument destined to satisfy lust or to procreate children. Nor did he blush at the fact that those who were to be placed as wives were bought and sold like corporeal things, the power having sometimes been given to the father or the husband to condemn the wife to the extreme torture, in quotes. This is from the same document, same encyclical, but Article 387. Article 63. Monogamous marriage is the expression of a mutual and exclusive search for the good of the other. Quote, it's necessary that they always have their minds so disposed as to understand that one owes to the other a very great love, a constant faith, a solicitous and continuous help, in quotes. This is from the same encyclical, but Article 389. This reality of being one flesh, in quotes, acquires with Christ a new and precious motivation and reaches its fullness in the sacrament of matrimony. Quote, it should be added that marriage is a sacrament precisely for this, that it's a sacred sign which produces grace and renders an image of the mystical wedding of Christ with the Church. The form and shape of these are then expressed by that same bond of perfect union by which man and woman are joined together, and which is nothing other than marriage itself, in quotes. It's from Arcanum Divinae Sapientiae, the same encyclical, but Article 394. The next subsection is Pius XI. Article 64. Pope Pius XI offers a further development of the doctrine on marital unity in the encyclical Casti Connubii. He emphasizes the value of the, quote, mutual fidelity of the spouses in the fulfillment of the marriage contract, so that what pertains by this contract sanctioned by divine law to the spouse alone is neither denied to him nor permitted to a third person, in quotes. And he concludes, quote, this faith therefore demands in the first place the absolute unity of marriage, which the Creator himself foreshadowed in the marriage of the first parents, wanting it to be only between one man and one woman, in quotes. That's from Pius XII's 11th encyclical Casti Connubii, Article 546, I believe. Article 65. The Pontiff then enriches the teaching on the unity of marriage by proposing a new reflection on conjugal love, quote, which pervades all the duties of conjugal life and in Christian marriage holds the primacy of nobility, in quotes. That's from the same document, but from 547 to 548, and it's referencing Augustine's De Bono Coniugali 2432. And the noblest thing that can be found in marriage is conjugal love, especially when it reaches the supernatural level of charity through grace. As a consequence, the marital union becomes a path of spiritual growth. Quote, it does not only include mutual help, but must also extend to, and indeed aim above all at this, that the spouses help each other for an ever better interior formation and perfection, so that in their mutual union of life they grow ever more in the virtues, especially in sincere charity towards God and towards their neighbor. This mutual interior formation of the spouses, with the assiduous effort to perfect each other in a certain very true sense, can also be said to be the primary cause and motive of marriage, in quotes. That's from the same encyclical, but Article 548. This broadening, in quotes, of the meaning of marriage, which goes beyond the narrow sense predominant until then of an institution ordered to the procreation and proper education of offspring, has opened the way for a deeper understanding of the unitive meaning of marriage and sexuality. Article 66. One can also recall how in his time Pope Pius XI felt compelled to highlight those tendencies contrary to monogamy, which have become much more common today. Quote, those who think that we should be indulgent towards the ideas and customs of our time, regarding false and harmful friendships with third parties, and who maintain that in these external relationships, spouses should be allowed a certain greater license to think and act, are corrupting fidelity first of all, and that is all the more true since, as they say, not a few have an innate sexual constitution which they cannot satisfy within the narrow confines of a monogamous marriage. Therefore, that disposition of mind by which honest spouses condemn and refuse every affection and libidinous act with a third person, they consider an antiquated weakness of mind and heart, or an abject and vile jealousy. Therefore, they declare the penal laws of the state regarding the obligation of conjugal faith to be null and void, in quotes. And that's from the same encyclical Casti Connubii, but Article 566. The next subsection says the time is titled The Times of the Second Vatican Council. Article 67. Following the path opened by Casti Connubii, the Second Vatican Council presents marriage first of all as a work of God, which consists in a communion of love and life, which the two spouses share, a communion which is not only oriented towards procreation, but also towards the integral good of both. Marriage is defined as an, quote, intimate communion of life and conjugal love, in quotes. That's from Gaudium Spes, Article 48. In marriage, the man and the woman who, through the conjugal covenant, quote, are no longer two but one flesh, which is Matthew 19:6, offering each other mutual help and service through the intimate union of their persons and activities, experience the sense of their own unity and achieve it ever more fully. This intimate union as a mutual gift of two persons, as well as the good of the children, demand the full fidelity of the spouses and demand their indissoluble unity, end quotes. It's from the same document, Gaudium Spes, Article 48. Article 68. Christ himself, quote, comes to meet Christian spouses through the sacrament of marriage. He also remains with them so that just as he loved the church and gave himself up for her, so too spouses may love one another faithfully forever with mutual dedication. Authentic conjugal love is taken up into divine love and is sustained and enriched by the redemptive power of Christ and the saving action of the church, in quotes. It's from the same document, Gaudium Spes, Article 48. In this way, it's possible to live conjugal love, quote, being directed from person to person with a feeling that arises from the will, that love embraces the good of the whole person. Therefore, it has the possibility of enriching with a particular dignity the expressions of the body and of the psychic life, and of ennobling them as special elements and signs of conjugal friendship. The Lord has deigned to heal perfect, and elevate this love with a special gift of grace and charity. Such love, uniting human and divine values, leads spouses to a free and mutual gift of themselves, which is expressed through tender feelings and gestures and pervades the entire life of the spouses, end quotes. Also from Gaudium Spes, but Article 49. Sexual acts in marriage, quote, carried out in a truly human way, foster the mutual giving which they signify, and enrich the spouses themselves mutually with joy and gratitude, end quote. That's from Gaudium et Spes 49 as well. Article 69. The Council refers explicitly to marital unity to express that it, quote, confirmed by the Lord, is also clearly evident from the equal personal dignity which must be recognized in both man and woman in their mutual and complete love, end quotes. That's from Gaudium et Spes, again, Article 49. The defense of marital unity in the Council is thus based on two firm points. On the one hand, the Council reiterates that marital union is all-encompassing, quote, it pervades the entire life of the spouses, end quotes. It's also from Gaudium et Spes 49, and consequently is only possible between two people. On the other, it underlines that such love corresponds to the spousal dignity of each of the two spouses, who in the case of a plural, in quotes, union, would find themselves in the situation of having to share with others, which should be intimate and exclusive, thus becoming like objects in a relationship which debases their own personal dignity. There's a footnote that says, this same argument was taken up by St. John Paul II when he explained that polygamy, quote, is contrary to the equal personal dignity of man and woman, who in marriage give themselves with a love that is total and therefore unique and exclusive, end quotes. This is from his exhortation Familiaris Consortio, Article 19. And it references Vatican II's Gaudium et Spes, Article 47. End of the footnote. Article 70. St. Paul VI, having concluded the council and resuming his reflections on marriage, expresses a profound concern regarding the themes of marriage and the family. Even if in Humanae Vitae he wishes to underline the procreative meaning of marriage and sexual acts, at the same time he wishes to show this meaning is inseparable from the other, the unitive one. In fact, he affirms that, quote, because of its intimate structure, the conjugal act, while profoundly uniting the spouses, makes them capable of generating new lives, end quotes. This is from Humanae Vitae, Article 12, from Paul VI. In this context, he reaffirms the value of reciprocity and exclusivity, which recalls the communion of love and mutual perfection. There's the same references also Humanae Vitae, Article 8. There is an, quote, inseparable connection, in quotes, between the two meanings of sexual acts. Quote, by safeguarding both these essential aspects, the unitive and the procreative, the conjugal act fully preserves the sense of mutual and true love and the ordination to man's highest vocation and fatherhood, end quotes. That's from Humanae Vitae, Article 12. St. John Paul II later clarified, quote, total physical donation would be a lie if it were not the sign and fruit of total personal donation, end quotes. That's from Familiaris Consortio, Article 11. The next subsection is about St. John Paul II's magisterium, Article 71. St. John Paul II uses Christ's reference in the beginning to introduce in the reflection on the spousal relationship the hermeneutic of the gift. There's a footnote referencing his general audience on January 2nd, 1980, his general audience on January 9th, 1980, and his general audience on January 6th, 1980. In creation, God's self-giving is revealed, and creation itself constitutes the fundamental and original gift. The human being is the only creature who can receive the created world as a gift and who can, at the same time, as the image of God, make his own life a gift. It is in this logic that the spousal meaning of the human body in its masculinity and femininity reveals that the human being was created to give himself to the other, and that only in this gift of himself does he bring to completion the true meaning of his being and his existence. There it's referencing Gaudium et Spes number 24. Article 72. In this context, in his exposition of the Christian concept of monogamy, St. John Paul II supports the Semitic and non-Western origin of its deepest foundations, affirming that, quote, it appears as the expression of the interpersonal relationship, one in which each of the two partners is recognized by the other as having equal value and in the totality of his person. This monogamous and personalist concept of the human couple is an absolutely original revelation, which bears the mark of God, which deserves to be ever more deeply explored, end quotes. That's from John Paul II's homily at the Mass for Families in Kinshasa on May 3rd, 1980. Article 73. The Holy Pontiff must, however, recognize that, quote, the whole tradition of the Old Covenant indicates that the effective need for monogamy never reached the conscience of successive generations of the chosen people. Their ethos, idolatry, is not understood as it appears from the point of view of monogamy established by the Creator. There, end quote. That's a reference to John Paul II's General Audience on August 13th, 1980. For this reason, he strives to read the Old Testament not from the normative point of view, but from the theological point of view, and he does so starting from two cornerstones. The first is Christ's will to return to the beginning. There's referencing John Paul II's General Audience on August 20th, 1980, to the origin of creation when the original couple was monogamous in the sense of, quote, two in one flesh, end quotes. Here's a quote, quote, God made man in his own likeness, creating him male and female. This is what is surprising right from the start. Humanity to resemble God must be a couple of two people who move towards each other, end quotes. This is from his homily, again, at the Mass for Families in Kinshasa, May 3rd, 1980. The other point of reference is the reflection of the prophets on the exclusive love between God and his people, for which, quote, they often denounce the abandonment of the true God Yahweh by the people, comparing it to adultery. Adultery is a sin because it constitutes the breaking of the personal alliance between man and woman. In many texts, monogamy appears to be the only and correct analogy of monotheism understood in the categories of the alliance, that is, of fidelity and trust in the one and true God Yahweh. Husband of Israel, adultery is the antithesis of that spousal relationship. It's the antinomy of marriage, in quotes. That's from his General Audience on August 27th, 1980. Article 74. Following this line of thought, St. John Paul II maintains that the union does not express God's original will for monogamy if the other person, even if the union is exclusive, becomes merely an object used to satisfy one's own desires. Quote, the personal union, or communion, in quotes, to which man and women are mutually called, quote, from the beginning, in quotes, does not correspond, but rather conflicts with it if one of the two persons exists only as a subject for the satisfaction of sexual need, and the other becomes exclusively the object of such satisfaction. Furthermore, the case where both man and woman exist reciprocally as an object for the satisfaction of sexual need, and each for her part is merely the subject of that satisfaction, does not correspond to the unity of communion. Indeed, it conflicts with it. Such a reduction of such a rich content of the mutual and perennial attraction of human persons extinguishes the personal meaning and the communion meaning proper to man and woman, end quotes. That's from his General Audience on September 24th, 1980. Article 75. The gift of the, quote, Holy Spirit poured out in the sacramental celebration offers Christian spouses the gift of a new communion of love, which is a living and real image of that most singular unity which makes the Church the indivisible, mystical body of the Lord Jesus, a stimulating impulse so that they may progress every year, every day, towards an ever richer union between them at all levels of bodies, characters, hearts, minds, wills, souls, end quotes. That's from John Paul II's Apostolic Exhortation Familiaris Consortio, Article 19. The next subsection is about Benedict XVI's Magisterium, Article 76. Benedict XVI takes up this teaching again when he also recalling the story of creation, that, quote, Eros is rooted in the very nature of man. Adam is searching and abandons his father and mother, end quotes, to find the woman. Only together do they represent the entirety of humanity. They become one flesh, end quotes. The second aspect is no less important. In an orientation founded in creation, Eros refers man to marriage, to a bond characterized by uniqueness and definitiveness. Thus and only thus is its intimate destination realized, end quote. That's from Benedict XVI's encyclical Deus Caritas Est, Article 11. Article 77. Benedict XVI also taught that marriage does nothing other than gather and bring to completion that disruptive force which is love, which in its dynamic of exclusivity and definitiveness does not want to mortify human freedom, but on the contrary opens life to nothing less than a horizon of eternity. Quote, it is part of the development of love towards higher levels, towards its intimate purifications, that it now seeks definitiveness, and this in a double sense, in the sense of exclusivity, only this one person, in quotes, and in the sense of forever, in quotes, end of the quote. That's from Deus Caritas Est as well, but Article 6. The next subsection is about Pope Francis's Magisterium, Article 78. Pope Francis has given us an original reflection rooted in concrete experience on various aspects of the exclusive union of spouses, and the 4th chapter of the Apostolic Exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, where one can find a detailed description of conjugal love and its various manifestations, taking as its starting point 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7. First of all, patience, without which, quote, we will always have an excuses for responding with anger, and in the end we will become people who do not know how to live together, antisocial, and capable of controlling our impulses, end quote. That's from Amoris Laetitia, Article 92. Then benevolence, doing good, in quotes, as a, quote, dynamic and creative reaction towards others, in quotes. That's Article 93 of Amoris Laetitia. Then kindness, because those who have learned to love, quote, hate making others suffer, in quotes. That's from Article 99 of Amoris Laetitia. And, quote, are capable of speaking words of encouragement, which comfort, which give strength, and which console, which can stimulate, end quotes. That's from Article 100. Love also implies a certain self-detachment, in quotes, to give oneself freely to the point of giving one's life, end quote. So that's also from Amoris Laetitia, Articles 101 to 102. That's actually not a quote, that's a reference. Consequently, love is capable of overcoming interior violence towards the defects of others, which, quote, put us on the defensive before others, in quotes, and, quote, ends up isolating us, end quote. That's from Amoris Laetitia 103. To all this is added forgiveness, which, quote, presupposes the experience of being forgiven by God, end quotes. That's from Article 108. The capacity to rejoice with others so that, quote, whoever does something good in life knows that they will celebrate it with him, end quotes. It's from Article 110. And trust, because love, quote, leaves freedom. It renounces the attempt to control everything, to possess, to dominate, end quotes. It's from Article 115. Finally, love hopes for the other. Quote, it always hopes that a maturation is possible, a surprising blossoming of beauty, that the potentialities of his being will one day sprout, end quotes. That's from Article 116. Article 79. Pope Francis thus helps us to embody, in quotes, what conjugal charity, in quotes, is. At the same time, with healthy realism, he warns of the danger of idealizing the marital union with inadequate deductions, as if the theological mysteries had to find a perfect correspondence in the life of the couple, and the latter had to be perfect in every circumstance. In reality, this would create a constant sense of guilt in the more fragile spouses who struggle and do their best to maintain their union. Quote, it is not good to confuse different levels. One must not place upon two limited persons the tremendous burden of having to reproduce in a perfect manner the union that exists between Christ and his church, because marriage as a sign implies, quote, and this is a quote within it, a dynamic process which advances gradually with the progressive integration of the gifts of God. End of the whole quote. And the footnote is referencing, it's referencing Amoris Laetitia, Article 122, and it was quoting John Paul II's Familiaris Consortio, Article 9. End of footnote. Instead, we must positively evaluate all the efforts, the painful moments, the challenges that have surprised and destabilized the spouses, the changes in the loved one, and even the defeats that have subsequently been overcome, is part of a journey where the Holy Spirit works as he wishes, because in this way, quote, after having suffered and fought together, the spouses can experience that it was worth it, because they have achieved something good. They have learned something together, or because they can appreciate much more what they have. Few human joys are as profound and joyful as when two people who love each other have achieved something greater that cost them a great shared effort, end quotes. That's from Amoris Laetitia, Article 130. Now it's Pope Leo XIV's magisterium being discussed. Article 80. Among the first interventions of Pope Leo XIV, in reference to the theme of this note, what could take into consideration that he expressed in the message of the commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the canonization of the couples Louis and Zélie Martin, parents of Saint Therese of the Child Jesus. On that occasion, the Holy Father refers to the, quote, model of the couple that the Holy Church presents to young people, end quotes, as, quote, such a beautiful adventure, a model of fidelity and attention to others, a model of fervor and perseverance in the faith, of the Christian education of children, of generosity in the exercise of charity and social justice, a model also of trust in times of trial, end quotes. And that's from that reference to that message on October 18th, 2025. Article 81. In truth, the motto of Pope Leo XIV, in illo uno unum, in him who is one, we are one, taken from a passage of St. Augustine. The footnote references Augustine's narrations on the Psalms 127:3. No, and here's the quote from it: Non ille unus et nos multi, sed et nos multi in illo uno unum, in quotes, in the footnote. It could be applied to the life of a couple, suggesting that being one, in quotes, is possible and fully realizable in God. In this sense, marital unity finds its foundation and its completeness in the relationship with God. On the occasion of the Jubilee of Families, grandparents, and the elderly, Pope Leo XIV, addressing spouses directly, reiterated that, quote, marriage is not an ideal, but the canon of true love between man and woman, a total, faithful, fruitful love. While transforming you into one flesh, this same love makes you capable in the image of God of giving life, in quotes. That's from his homily on June 1st, 2025. And he was quoting Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, Article 9, within that quote. Article 82. The Code of Canon Law refers to the, quote, matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and to the procreation and education of offspring, in quotes. It recalls that, quote, among the baptized it has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament, in quotes. This is from Canon 1055 and paragraph 1, and it's also referencing Canon 776 and it's the subsections 1 and 2 of the Eastern Church's canon law. Article 83. Finally, in its synthetic vision, the Catechism of the Catholic Church states that, quote, polygamy is contrary to the equal dignity and to conjugal love, which is unique and exclusive, in quotes. That's from the Catechism, Article 1645. Furthermore, quote, conjugal love demands from spouses by its very nature an inviolable fidelity. This is the consequence of the gift of themselves which spouses make to each other, in quotes. That's from Catechism, Article 1646. For this reason, quote, adultery is an injustice. Whoever commits it fails to fulfill the commitment undertaken. He wounds that sign of the covenant, which is the marriage bond, injures the rights of the other spouse, and attacks the institution of marriage, violating the contract on which it is founded. It compromises the good of human generation and of children who need the stable union of their parents, end quote. That's from Article 2381. This does not exclude the possibility of understanding, quote, the drama of those who, desiring to convert to the gospel, find themselves obliged to repudiate one or more women with whom they have shared years of married life. However, polygamy is in contrast with the moral law. It radically contradicts conjugal communion, end quotes. This is from Article 2387. Part 4, some perspectives from philosophy and cultures. And the first subsection is in classical Christian thought. Article 84. In St. Thomas Aquinas, we can find a Christian philosophical thought which has become classic on the foundations of monogamy. In the third book of the Summa Contra Gentiles, his conception appears above all under the philosophical profile, with reasoning drawn from natural theology and from his knowledge of the biology of the time. The spousal relationship is thus presented as a bond of the natural order, a, quote, society of man and woman, end quotes. That's Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 123, number 4. Or a form of, quote, social bond, socialis conjunctio, end quote. That's from the same work, the same author, St. Thomas Aquinas, but Summa Theologiae, prima pars, question 92, answer 3, in response, and then also Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 123, in 4. Inherent in human nature, which unites man and woman. Article 85. St. Thomas maintains that monogamy derives essentially from natural instinct, being inscribed in the nature of every human being. This sphere, therefore, prescinds from the demands of faith. In fact, quote, man naturally desires to be certain of his offspring, which certainly would be completely eliminated if several men had only one woman. Therefore, it follows from natural instinct that there should be only one woman and for one man. End quote. That's from Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 124, number 1. This union, which consolidates the mutual balance between man and woman, is governed by quote, a natural equity, in quotes. There is therefore no room either for some form of polyandry nor for polygamy, which, among other things, Aquinas defines as a form of slavery. Quote, it's also evident that the dissolution of the aforementioned society is incompatible with equity. If, therefore, a man taking a woman in her youth, when she's beautiful and fertile, could leave her later when she's old, he would be doing the woman an injustice against natural equity. On the other hand, if a man could abandon his wife, there would be a society of equals between man and woman, with slavery on the part of the woman, in quotes. That's from chapter 123, numbers 3 to 4 of the Summa Contra Gentiles. Article 86. Furthermore, equity in love establishes a substantial equality between spouses, that is, a fundamental equality between man and woman. Quote, friendship consists in a certain equality. Therefore, if a woman were not allowed to have more than one husband, so as not to jeopardize the security of her offspring, while a husband were permitted to have more than one wife, friendship between man and woman would not be liberal, but almost servile. And this argument is proven by experience, since among men who have more than one wife, these are held almost as slaves. Quote, and this is a quote within the quote, an intense friendship is not possible towards many people, in quotes, as the philosopher explains in Ethics 4. If therefore the wife had only one husband, but the husband had more than one wife, friendship would not be equal on both sides. End of the whole quote. That's from Summa Contra Gentiles, chapter 124, numbers 3 through 5. He's quoting Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics 8, chapter C5, number 5, and also referencing 8, C6, number 2. Article 87. Marital fidelity, therefore, has as its foundation that highest degree of friendship which is established between man and woman. This friendship, at the highest degree, maxima amicitia, as a love of benevolence, amor benevolentiae, different from the mere love of concupiscence, amor concupiscentiae, which is oriented rather towards one's own advantage, leads to an intimate and total exchange between equals, in which each partner gives himself without reserve, seeking the good of the other. Quote, the greater the friendship, the more firm and lasting it is. Now between husband and wife there is a very great friendship, maxima amicitia, since they are united not only for carnal intercourse, which even among beasts establishes a certain sweet society, but for the communion of all domestic life, so that to express this, the man, quote, leaves even his father and mother for his wife, in quotes, as it is said in Genesis 2:24. End of the whole quote. As from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 123, number 6. The next subsection is entitled Communion of Two People, Article 88. In the 20th century, some Christian philosophers emphasized a vision of marriage as a union between persons or a communion of life. In the context of classical Thomistic thought, Antonin Dalmas Sertillange presents marriage is a union of two persons, which can never be understood as a kind of fusion or destruction of themselves to constitute a superior unity, nor even as a pure means of procreation for the good of the species. Quote, man, precisely because he is a person, that is, an end in himself, man who is valid in himself independently of the species, will seek in his union, together with the good of the species, also his own good. If, therefore, man and woman found a life cemented by love, this life will develop in two centers like an ellipse and two focuses, without anyone being sacrificed. End quotes. This is from his work Christian Love, page 87. Article 89. Consistent with this thought, Sertillange shows that in marriage, even the pursuit of a good for oneself constitutes a way of taking the other person seriously, opening up for him the possibility of being fruitful thanks to his spouse. Quote, certainly it's better to give than to receive, we said, but receiving is also a giving. O my heart, receive, so that your friend may find in you the testimony of what he gives. Be happy, so that your friend may say, I therefore bring happiness, end quotes. It's from page 79. In this way, quote, in the conjugal union, the two lives are enriched all the better, the closer their association is destined to become, and their mutual contributions are destined by nature to complement each other, end quotes. It's from page 91. Because, quote, this love which makes two people united, that what each of them alone could not be, is the most decisive natural enrichment, end quote. That's from page 92. In this way, marital communion implies a, quote, double preference, which intertwines to form the strongest of knots, and makes each of the two simultaneously the most loving and the most loved. It makes each obtain what is due to him, just as he procures it for the other, the happiness of being one and two, end quotes. It's from page 94. And the next subsection is a person entirely referred to another, Article 90. At this point, it's useful to connect three authors who have increasingly explored a line of thought on marital unity. The first is Søren Kierkegaard, who is convinced that a person realizes himself when he's capable of going out of himself, thus making love and union possible. Quote, love is abandonment, but abandonment is possible only thanks to the fact that I go out of myself, end quotes. That's from Kierkegaard's The Aesthetic Validity of Marriage, page 154. Accepting the risk and the unpredictability. Only in this way does that decision to belong fully to a single person become possible with all the risks that this decision may entail. Quote, a decisive step is needed, and therefore courage is needed for this, and yet marital love collapses into nothingness when this does not take place, because it is only thanks to this that one shows that one does not love oneself but the other. How should one show if not thanks to the fact that one is only for another, end quotes. It's from the same work, which is done by, edited by Cortese, Piccola Biblioteca Adelphi 120, in Adelphi, Milan, by the way, and that's on pages 153 to 154. Consequently, the Danish philosopher maintains, quote, he became aware of the affront, and therefore of how unfortunate it is to want to love with a part of the soul, but not with the whole, to reduce one's own love to a moment, and therefore to take all the love of another person, end quotes. From the same, it's from Kierkegaard's The Balance Between the Aesthetic and the Ethical in the Development of Personality, also published by Piccola Biblioteca Adelphi 232 on page 207. Article 91. Thus we find the foundation of monogamy precise in the idea of a person, which allows us at the same time to understand the meaning of our own existence and to love that of our spouse. The interior call to abandon ourselves before the other thus becomes the foundation of, quote, loving only one, end quotes. That's from his Kierkegaard's Aesthetic Validity of Marriage, Article 92. Kierkegaard himself confirms this when he recognizes that if there is a true love that makes us go out of ourselves towards the other, quote, lovers are intimately convinced that their relationship is a perfect whole in itself, end quotes. It's from page 39 of the same work. He also recognizes that this reality means for our spouses a call to, quote, transform the instant of enjoyment into a small eternity, end quotes, from page 40. This then implies the action of the spiritual will above all, the reference to God, without separating marriage, including its component of enjoyment and sexuality, from the love of God. Quote, lovers refer their love to God, end quotes, who effectively, quote, will give it an absolute imprint of eternity, end quotes. That's from page 86. Now, Article 92. These sources also nourish the personalism of Emmanuel Mounier, which starts from the, quote, absolute value of the human person, end quotes. That's from E. Mounier's Manifesto at the Service of Community Personalism, translated and edited by A. Lamacchia Ecumenica Cassano, 1975, page 66, whose full realization can only come about through self-giving in a process which transfigures all the tensions of the personality. It's from page 82 of that same work. On the contrary, quote, constituted in a closed society, the family is made up of, in the image of the individual, proposed to it by the bourgeois world, in quotes. That's from page 130. And in this way, it constitutes only the sum of two particularisms, not a union. If its true nature is understood, quote, individuals must sacrifice their particularism to it. It is an adventure to be undertaken, a commitment to be made fruitful, end quotes. That's from page 131. But this is on condition that they strive towards it with all their effort. This totalizing union is between two and does not admit rivals. Also a supporter of personalism, Jean Lacroix draws inspiration more directly from Kierkegaard and expresses similar ideas under the figure of the mutual recognition of two people, s'avouer l'un l'autre, which opens them to communion with all. Quote, at the moment in which they recognize each other, the spouses simultaneously recognize each other before a superior reality that transcends them. The family, in fact, can undoubtedly be the place, the source, and the archetype of all sociality. It will therefore be the analysis of recognition itself that will allow us to discern what is authentic and what is illusory in the conception of the family understood as the primary cell of society, in quotes. That's from J. Lacroix's Force et Faiblesse de la Famille, Édition du Seuil, Paris, in 1948, page 56. The recognition of the other is, quote, the human act that fully assumes the character of intimacy and the character of sociality, in quotes, and in this way corresponds to the transcendental desire of love in its richest sense. That's referencing page 54 of that same text of Lacroix. But it is a question of recognizing the other, quote, as other, in quotes. That's from page 58. In this way, the tendency to fight against the other, quote, is transformed into mutual recognition, in quotes. That's from page 58. In this horizon, we understand that the foundation of marriage, quote, which is essentially love, cannot be anything other than integral recognition. Recognition of the body, recognition of the soul, total recognition of this incarnate spirit, which is the concrete man, in quotes. That's from pages 61 to 62. Therefore, monogamy emerges clearly from the affirmation that marriage between a man and a woman is a, quote, superior unity, in quotes, to any other on this earth. Quote, the family is the greatest realization of the human unity, in quotes. This is from page 55. The next section is face to face. Article 94. The French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, with his reflection on the face of the other, proposes to always discover the personal relationship as a, quote, face to face, in quotes. Thanks to the face, which always imposes its own recognition, personal interiority becomes communicable and requires the ever new discovery of the other, in quotes. This is from his Totality and Infinity. And it's in front and thorough 92, Jacob Book, Milan, 2006, pages 191 to 253. Sexual desire, when it moves within the dynamic of the face of the other, can adequately hold together sensitivity and transcendence, self-affirmation and recognition of otherness. In this face-to-face, the caress acts as an expression of love that seeks union by admiring, respecting, and preserving otherness. Quote, it's not an intention of unveiling, but of research, a journey into the invisible, in quotes. It's from page 265. Levinas's thought could be a fruitful way to explore the meaning of marriage as an exclusive union, a face-to-face relationship that is only possible between two people and which, when fully realized, claims for itself an exclusive, mutual belonging, incommunicable, and non-transferable outside of that, quote, we two, in quotes. Article 95. Polygamy, adultery, or polyamory are based on the illusion that the intensity of a relationship can be found in a succession of faces. As the myth of Don Juan illustrates, the number dissolves the name. It disperses the unity of the amorous impulse. If Levinas showed that the face of the other summons an infinite, unique, and irreducible responsibility, multiplying faces in a supposedly total union means fragmenting the meaning of marital love. The next subsection is the thought of Caro Wojtyła. Article 96. Behind the well-known catechesis on love offered by St. John Paul II as pontiff, we can find the philosophical reflection developed by the young bishop Caro Wojtyła. This reflection helps us to understand in depth the meaning of the unique and exclusive union of marriage. Article 97. The young Polish thinker takes the theme of this note very seriously. He explains that marriage has, quote, an interpersonal structure. It's a union and a community of two persons, end quotes. It's from Love and Responsibility, translated by A. Milanoli Marietti, Genoa, Milan, 1980, page 161. This is, quote, its essential character, end quotes, quote, the interior and essential reason for being a marriage, end quotes, which is, quote, above all, to constitute a union of two persons, end quotes. This is its, quote, integral value, end quotes, which remains even beyond procreation. And that's a reference to page 161 again. Article 98. At the foundation of all his thought is what he himself calls the, quote, personalist principle, in quotes, which requires, quote, treating the person in a way that corresponds to his being, in quotes, and not, quote, in the situation of an object of enjoyment at the service of another person, in quotes. It's from page 155. As happens in polygamy, being a person necessarily implies that, quote, he can never be an object of utilitarian enjoyment for another, but only an object, more exactly a co-subject of love, in quotes. It's from page 155 as well. Because, quote, he cannot be treated as an object of use, therefore as a means, end quote. That's from page 29. Article 99. Wojtyła's thought allows us to understand why only monogamy guarantees that sexuality develops within a framework of recognition of the other as a subject with whom one shares one's life entirely, a subject who is an end in himself and never a means to be one to one's own needs. Sexual union, which involves the whole person, can treat the other precisely as a person, that is, as a co-subject of love, and not an object of use, only if it develops within the framework of a unique and exclusive belonging. In this case, those who give themselves fully and completely to the other can only be two. In any other case, it would be a partial gift of self, because such a gift must leave room for others, and consequently all would be treated as means and not as persons. For these reasons, he concludes that, quote, strict monogamy is a manifestation of the personalist order, end quotes. It's from page 159. Article 100. In the same work, Karl Wojtyła broadens his reflection on monogamy with an original development on the unitive purpose of sexuality, which becomes an expression and a maturation of the objective fact, which is a marital unity as an essential property of marriage. For this reason, he forcefully denies the rigorous thesis, which he considers to be typical of Manichaean, in quotes, or ultra-spiritualist, in quotes, visions, according to which, quote, the Creator uses man and woman, as well as their sexual relations, to ensure the existence of the species Homo. Thus he uses persons as means, end quotes. This is from page 43. Only in this context, for that mentality, would sexual pleasure become tolerable. Wojtyła instead maintains that, quote, it's not at all incompatible with the objective dignity of persons that their conjugal love involves sexual enjoyment, in quotes. There exists a joy which is in conformity with the nature of the sexual tendency and at the same time with the dignity of persons, and the vast field of love between man and woman. It springs from common action, from mutual understanding, from the harmonious fulfillment of goals chosen together. This joy, this enjoyment, can come both from the multifaceted pleasure created by the difference between the sexes and from the sexual voluptuousness offered by conjugal relations, a condition that their love develops normally from the sexual impulse, in quotes. This is from page 44. Article 101. In his effort to avoid the rigorous extreme, which ultimately excludes the unitive finality of sexuality in marriage, Wojtyła explains that the other can be truly loved as a person and at the same time be fully desired. These two things, quote, differ from each other, but not to the point of excluding each other, in quotes, because, quote, a person can desire another as a good for himself, but can at the same time desire something good for him, independently of the fact that it is also a good for himself, in quotes. It's from page 62. Recognizing the integrity of the person and his needs, it must also be admitted that mutual love requires many other expressions, not only sexuality. If, quote, what the two people bring to love is solely or above all concupiscence in the search for enjoyment and pleasure, then reciprocity will be deprived of these characteristics, end quotes. This is page 63, which offers stability to marriage. Love is a virtue, trust, disinterested giving, etc. The next section is further on. Page 102. The marriage of Jacques and Raisa Maritain appears as a special case of intellectual, cultural, and spiritual communion, which cannot be presented as the only model, since the forms of conjugal union are certainly as diverse as the people themselves. Their special case, however, has much to say. Given the wonderful experience of sharing with Raisa an exterior church for truth, and above all for God, Jacques relativizes, without excluding it, the importance of desire, passion, and sexuality. Quote, the truth is this, in my opinion. First of all, love as desire or passion, and romantic love, or at least an element of it, should as far as possible be present in marriage as a first incentive, as a starting point. Secondly, marriage, far from having as its primary purpose that of bringing romantic love to its perfect fulfillment, has to accomplish a very different work in human hearts, an infinitely deeper and more mysterious operation of alchemy, in quotes. This is from Jacques Maritain's Reflections on America, edited by A. Barbieri, Works of Jacques Maritain 1, Morcelliana, Brescia, 2022, page 109. He is fascinated by, quote, a truly disinterested love, which does not exclude sex, of course, but which becomes increasingly independent of sex, in quotes. That's from the same work, the page, in the same page, 109. He is not referring to, in a Gnostic or Jansenist sense, to a spiritual love completely disconnected from corporeality or earthly realities, because such an interpretation would be contrary to his anthropological thought, but precisely to the ideal of, quote, a complete and irrevocable gift of one to the other for love and of the other. Thus, it is that marriage can be an authentic community of love between man and woman, something built not on sand but on rock, end quotes. This is from page 110. This ideal of the full gift of oneself to the spouse implies, quote, the arduous discipline of self-sacrifice, and by dint of renunciations and purifications. Each, in other words, can then become truly dedicated to the good and salvation of the other. It's from the same place in the work. In this context, he underlines the constant need for forgiveness, quote, prepared and ready, just as a guardian angel must be to forgive others a lot. In fact, the evangelical law of mutual forgiveness expresses well, it seems to me, a fundamental need, end quote. That's from the same place. Article 103. In this text, Maritain's philosophical gaze is revealed as completely transfigured by a supernatural vision, where the power of theological love pushes the person who loves completely beyond himself in search of the good of the other, to the fullness of this good of the beloved, which consists in his salvation, that is, in his total union with God. This profoundly spiritual vision of Maritain seems to exclude a complete philosophical treatment of marital love that we can find in other authors, but it has the great merit of guiding our reflection on monogamous love and an ascent towards the highest values, where such love matures in a self-sacrificing sense, which in marriage takes the form of a radical union. This admirable union manifests itself in the sincere and constant concern for the good of the other as a supernatural movement, and the tender and generous search for the full and total fulfillment of the loved one and the saving love of God. Article 104. However, in a later text, one can perceive a greater philosophical precision. These are the annotations that Maritain developed starting from his wife's diary, published after her death. They are annotations completed by Maritain himself and published separately. There he's referencing Jacques Maritain's Love and Friendship, Morcelliana, Brescia, 1964 and 1987. Already in the first pages, the theme of that very special love, which reaches very high levels of generosity and disinterestedness, returns. The French philosopher calls it mad love, in quotes, passim, because it is also a love, quote, considered an extreme and completely absolute form, end quotes. That's from page 14 of that work. Characterized, quote, by the power it has to alienate the soul from itself, in quotes. It's from page 15. But the novelty is that in this commentary on Rice's diary, he takes a decisive step. He positively integrates sexuality even in the context of that most perfect love. Starting from human nature made of spirit and body, and from the all-encompassing characteristic of marital love, he arrives at the affirmation, quote, a human person can give himself to another or be enraptured in another to the point of making this one his all, only if the other gives or is willing to give his body while giving his soul, in quotes. It's from page 18. In this supreme love between the two human beings, marital unity finds its most precious earthly expression. The next section is entitled Other Views. It's a larger section than the previous one, but still within part 4. Article 105. Seems useful here to also keep in mind a glance at the non-Christian East. Let us dwell, for example, on the traditions of India. In that region, although monogamy has usually been the norm and considered an ideal in married life, polygamy has continued to be present over the centuries. In any case, one of the oldest texts taken from the Hindu scriptures, the Manusmriti, states the following, quote, that mutual fidelity continues until death. This can be considered as the summary of the supreme law for husband and wife. that man and woman united in marriage constantly strive that they are not disunited and do not violate their mutual fidelity, in quotes. It's from the Manus Mirtiri 9, 101 to 102. An important text is often cited to defend monogamy, and that of the Srimad Bhagavatam or Bhagavata Purana, which states, quote, Lord Ramchandra vowed to accept only one wife and to have no ties with other women. He was a saintly king, and everything in his character was good, untainted by qualities such as anger, in quotes. It's from that work 9:10.54. When Ravana kidnaps his wife Sita, Lord Ramchandra, who could have taken any other woman as his wife, takes none. Furthermore, the emphasis placed on the wife's chastity in the Thirukural, a classical collection of aphorisms in Tamil, indicates the importance of total fidelity. Quote, if woman could preserve chastity, what more precious treasure could the world contain? She who keeps incessant vigil to protect herself, takes care of her husband and the good name of her family, give her the name of a woman, in quotes. It's from the Thirukural 54 and 56. Article 106. In connection with the philosophical and cultural reflections developed thus far, it is also appropriate to pay attention to the issue of education. Our era, in fact, is experiencing various trends regarding love, increasing divorce rates, the fragility of unions, the trivialization of adultery, and the promotion of polygamy. In light of all this, it must also be recognized that great collective narratives, novels, films, songs, continue to exalt the myth of the unique and exclusive great love, in quotes. The paradox is evident. Social practices undermine what the imagination celebrates. This reveals that the desire for monogamous love remains inscribed deep within the human being, even when behaviors seem to deny it. Article 107. How then can we preserve the possibility of faithful and monogamous love? The answer lies in education. It's not enough to denounce failures, starting from the values still preserved in the popular imagination. We must prepare generations to embrace the experience of love as an anthropological mystery. The world of social networks, where modesty fades and symbolic and sexual violence proliferates, demonstrates the urgent need for a new pedagogy. Love cannot be reduced to an impulse. It always calls upon the responsibility and capacity for hope of the whole person. Engagement, understood in its traditional sense, embodies this time of testing and maturation, which the other is welcomed as a promise of infinity. Thus, education in monogamy is not a moral constraint, but an initiation into the grandeur of a love that transcends immediacy. It directs erotic energy towards a wisdom of enduring and an openness to the divine. Monogamy is not archaism, but prophecy. It reveals that human love, lived in its fullness, somehow anticipates the very mystery of God. Part 5 is called the Poetic Word. Article 108. Speaking of poetic words, Pope Francis states that, quote, literary words are like a thorn in the heart that moves you to contemplation and sets you on the way. Poetry is open, it throws you elsewhere, in quotes. That's from his letter to poets. Long Live Poetry, or in the book Long Live Poetry, edited by A. Spadaro from Vatican, Libreria Editrice Vaticana, Rome, 2025, page 178. And he adds, quote, the artist is the man who, with his eyes, looks and at the same time dreams, sees more deeply, prophesies, announces a different way of seeing and understanding the things that are before our eyes. Indeed, poetry does not speak of reality starting from abstract principles, but by listening to reality itself, in quotes. That's from page 178 to 179 of the same work. Given these premises, it's impossible to ignore the poetic word in order to better grasp that mystery of love between two people who unite and belong to each other. Article 109. It's useful to note how many poets have sought to express the beauty of this unique and exclusive union. Acknowledging the power of their poetry now certainly does not imply that their lives were perfect, or that they were always faithful in love. In any case, it's clear that when they found love, they decided to belong exclusively to another person, or when they perceived the value of an exclusive union, these poets needed to express it through their art, as if to indicate that it was something beyond sexual satisfaction, the fulfillment of a personal need, or a superficial adventure. Some examples include, we drove around and around until we got home, the two of us. That's from Walt Whitman's We Too, How Long We Were Fooled, and His Leaves of Grass, New York, 1867, 114. We have circled and circled till we have arrived home again. We too have. And then the next one, this is translation from Italian. No one else, my love, will sleep with my dreams. You will go, we will go together across the waters of time. And that's a quote from P. Neruda, his sonetto number 81, in 20 poemas de amor y una canción, 100 sonetos de amor, in the collection Biblioteca Premios Nobel, to Atlaya, Barcelona, 1995, page 203. And then in Spanish, it's Ninguna más amor will sleep with my dreams. Irás, iremos juntos por las aguas del tiempo, in quotes. Article 110. In these words, we perceive that in a journey of respect and freedom, time consecrates the mutual choice, strengthens the bond, deepens the satisfaction of belonging to one another, enriches that we, in quotes, that comes to feel indestructible. In the context of this union, each of the two knows that, just as they have given something of themselves to the other, they have also received so much from their beloved. Here's a poem from E. Montale, I went down giving you my arm at least a million stars. It's in Italian, I believe, so here's the translation from Google Translate. I went down millions of stairs, giving you my arm, not because perhaps one could see more with 4 eyes. I went down with them with you, because I knew that between us the only true pupils, although so clouded, were yours. The next poem is from A Pozzi, Beauty, and I think it's also from Italian. It says, the translation, I give you myself, my sleepless nights, the long sips of sky and stars, drunk on the mountains, the breeze of the seas, crossed towards remote dawns. And you welcome my wander as a creature, my trembling as a living stem in the circle of horizons, bent to the clear wind of beauty. And you let me look at these eyes that God has given you, so full of sky, deep as centuries of light, sunk beyond the peaks. End quote. Article 111. The relationship is seen as irreplaceable, so that when the poet wants to rediscover his roots, he conceives himself as referring to the other person with a force that transcends time. And this next poem's from Pablo Neruda in Spanish, Pido Silencio. And it's from in his Obras Completas, and it's from the Odas Elementales, Memorial de Isla Negra, and it has a footnote. I go to close my eyes, and I only want 5 things. 5 favorite roots. 1 is love without end. The 5th thing is your eyes, my beloved Matilde. I don't want to sleep without your eyes. I don't want to be without you to be without looking at me. That's one of the translations, and I think it's pretty much the same as the one that's in the actual document. I will close my eyes, and I only want 5 things, 5 favorite roots. 1 is endless love. The 5th thing is your eyes, my beloved Matilda. I don't want to sleep without your eyes. I don't want to be without you looking at me. Article 112. In great poets, one generally does not find a naive romanticism, but a realism that recognizes the risks of static habituation, accepts the challenges that stimulate growth, at the same time does not lose sight of the need for an openness outside the narrow circle of the two. Here's another poem. This is from P. Eluard Nudu in Dernier Poème d'amour, and in French it's Nous nous tenons par la main, nous nous courons partout chez nous, auprès des sages et des fous, parmi les enfants et les grands. And here's how it translates that. The two of us holding hands, we believe ourselves to be at home everywhere, next to wise men and fools, among children and adults, in quotes. Article 113. This is rooted in the fact that the authenticity of this union excludes any form of self-contained fusion. Mutual belonging is not merely the fruit of personal need, but of a decision to belong to the other that allows us to overcome loneliness and abandonment. A decision that is simultaneously intimately marked by great respect for the other and for his or her personal mystery. Love, which sees in the other a unique value, perceives in its own way that the human person is non-transferable, in quotes, that it cannot be its own property and requires a similar attitude. Here's another poem. It's from R. Tagore titled Heart from the Gardener, edited by R. Russo, and it's from Milan 2021. I think it's in Italian originally. Your eyes question me sadly. They would like to probe all my thoughts. While the moon scans the sea, but it is my heart, my love. Its joys and its anxieties are immense, and its desires and its riches are infinite. This heart is as close to you as your own life, but you cannot know it completely. End quote. Article 114. In these few examples cited, it clearly emerges how the poetic word takes seriously the value of the exclusive union of two people who have freely decided to be together and to belong in an exclusive way to each other. What has been said about the all-encompassing nature of love can be summarized with the words of another great poet, Emily Dickinson, quote, "That love is all there is all we know of love," end quotes. The next section is major part is part 6, some reflections to be further explored further. Article 115. Thanks to the progress made thus far, it's now possible to gather a substantial body of considerations that can help us perceive the unique and exclusive marital union in a harmonious and multifaceted way. These considerations are in themselves useful for a valid understanding of the meaning of monogamy. However, it seems appropriate in this final part of the note to focus attention on some important specific points regarding the theme under consideration. As we have seen, the union of marriage could be expressed in various philosophical, theological, or poetic ways, but among the many possible ones, two appear decisive: mutual belonging and conjugal charity. Both have emerged frequently in various texts cited in this note. The first subsection, then, is called mutual belonging. Article 116. One way of expressing this exclusive union between two people is summed up in the expression mutual belonging. Already in the 5th century, St. Leo the Great referred to the mutual belonging of spouses when he spoke of the situation of soldiers who, presumed dead, return from war and discover that they have been, quote, replaced, in quotes, by others. The Pope then orders that, quote, each should receive what belongs to him, in quotes. That's from his letter Regressus ad Nos on March 21st, 458. This insight now leads us to reflect on this mutual belonging in a richer and deeper way. Article 117. It is St. Thomas Aquinas who affirms that to establish a friendship, quote, not even benevolence is enough, but mutual love is required, in quotes. That's from the Summa Theologiae Secunda Secundae Q23A1 response. Mutual belonging is based on the free consent of the two. Indeed, in the Latin rite of marriage, consent is expressed by saying, quote, I accept you as my bride, in quotes, and, quote, I accept you as my husband, in quotes. That's from the Roman Ritual Rite of Marriage, number 71, Libreria Liturgica Vaticana, Rome, 2008, 44-45. In this regard, following the dictates of the Second Vatican Council, it must be said that consent is a, quote, human act by which the spouses mutually give and receive each other. It quotes from Gaudium et Spes, number 48. And Canon Law 1057, Section 2 is being referenced, and then the Eastern Canon Law 817, Section 1. This act, quote, which binds the spouses to each other, in quotes, that's from the Catechism, Article 1627, is a giving and receiving of one another. It's the dynamism which gives rise to mutual belonging, called to deepen, to mature, to become ever more solid. In technical terms, mutual giving is the matter, mutual acceptance is the form. Article 118. It's no coincidence that St. Paul VI links the, quote, mutual personal gift, in quotes, in marriage to the unity of the bond, characterizing it as, quote, their own and exclusive, in quotes. That's from Humanae Vitae, Article 8. And still, on the subject of reciprocity, Karol Wojtyła maintains that it, quote, obliges us to consider the love of man and woman not only as the love of one for the other, but rather as something that exists between them. Love is not only in the woman, nor only in the man, because then we would ultimately have two loves, but it's unique. It is that thing which binds them. Its being, in its fullness, is interpersonal and not individual. It is reciprocity which in love decides the birth of this we, in quotes. It proves that love has matured, has become something between persons, has created a community, in quotes. This is from Love and Responsibility in Italian, pages 61 to 62. This reciprocity is a reflection of the Trinitarian life. Quote, Two persons whom a perfect love brings together in unity. This movement and this love makes them similar to God, who is the same love, the absolute unity of the three persons, end quotes. This is from his homily at the Mass for Families in Kinshasa, May 3, 1980. The unity of the relationship of the spouses is profoundly rooted in Trinitarian communion. Article 119. Pope Francis loved to speak of marriage in terms of freely chosen belonging because, quote, without a sense of belonging, one cannot sustain dedication to others. Each ends up seeking only his or her own convenience, end quotes. That's from Amoris Laetitia, Article 100. In marriage, each of the two, quote, expresses a firm decision to belong to one another. Getting married is a way of expressing that one has truly left the maternal nest to forge other strong bonds and take on a new responsibility towards another person. This is much more important than a mere spontaneous association for mutual gratification, end quotes. That's from Article 131. Mutual and exclusive belonging becomes a strong motivation for the stability of the union. Quote, in marriage, one also experiences the sense of belonging completely to one person. The spouses take on the challenge and the yearning to grow old and live out their lives together and thus reflect God's faithfulness. It's a belonging of the heart where only God sees. There's referencing Matthew 5:28. Every morning when we get up, we renew this decision of faithfulness before God. Whatever happens during the day, and each one, when he goes to sleep, waits to get up to continue this adventure, end quotes. This is from Amoris Laetitia, Article 319. The next subsection is called the Transformation, Article 120. With the passage of time, even when physical attraction and the possibility of sexual relations weaken, mutual belonging is not designed to dissolve. The option for the union of the two changes and transforms. Naturally, various intimate expressions of affection will not be lacking, which, however, are also considered exclusive, as expressions of the unique marital union, which cannot be offered to others without experiencing inadequacy. Precisely because the experience of mutual and exclusive belonging has deepened and strengthened over time, there are expressions that are reserved only for the person with whom one has chosen to share one's heart in a unique way. Article 121. For Pope Francis, this is precisely one of the advantages of understanding the marital union as mutual belonging. Quote, the intimate relationship and mutual belonging must be maintained for 4, 5, or 6 decades, and this entails the need to re-choose one another repeatedly. Perhaps the spouse is no longer attracted by an intense sexual desire that moves him or her towards the other person, but he or she feels the pleasure of belonging to that person and that that person belongs to him or her, of knowing that he or she is not alone, of having an accomplice, in quotes, who knows everything about his or her life and who shares everything. This is the companion on the journey of life, end quotes. That's from Article 163 of Amoris Laetitia. Thus, quote, although many confused feelings circulate in the heart, the decision to love, to belong to one another, to share one's entire life, and to continue to love and forgive one another remains alive every day. In the course of this journey, love celebrates each step and each new stage. The bond finds new modalities and demands the decision to reestablish it over and over again, not only to preserve it, but to make it grow, end quote. That's from Articles 163 to 164 of Amoris Laetitia. In any case, it must be recognized that mutual belonging is a way of understanding the conjugal union, which has as its greatest richness and at the same time limits, which it is essential to clarify. The next section is subsection is non-belonging. Article 122. A characteristic of the person is that he is an end in himself. The human being, quote, is the only known creature on earth that God willed for its own sake, end quotes. This is from Gaudium et Spes, Article 24. It can thus be said that man is an end in himself and therefore cannot be reduced to being merely the end of others. The person cannot be treated in a way that does not correspond to this dignity, which could be called infinite, in quotes. There is referencing the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith Decree Dignitas Infinita on April 8, 2024, the presentation in Numbers 1 and 6. Both because of the unlimited love that God has for him and because it is an absolute inalienable dignity, Every, quote, human individual has the dignity of a person. He is not just something but someone, end quotes. It's from the Catechism, Article 357. Consequently, the person, quote, cannot be treated as an object of use and therefore as a means, end quotes. As from Caro was Love and Responsibility in Italian, page 29. Article 123. When this conviction proper to true love that stops short of the sacred dimension of the other is lacking, the diseases of undue possession of the other easily develop. Manipulation, jealousy, harassment, infidelity, on the other hand, the mutual belonging proper to mutual exclusive love implies delicate care, a holy fear of profaning the freedom of the other, who has the same dignity and therefore the same rights. Those who love know that the other cannot be a means of resolving their own dissatisfaction. They know that their own emptiness must be fulfilled in other ways, never through domination of the other. This is what does not happen in many forms of unhealthy desire, which result in various manifestations of explicit and subtle violence, oppression, psychological pressure, control, and ultimately asphyxiation. This lack of respect and reverence for the dignity of the other is also found in those claims of complementarity where one of the two is forced to develop only some of his or her own possibilities, where the other finds ample room for personal expansion. To avoid all this, it must be recognized that there is no single model of marital reciprocity. In a healthy and generous relationship, quote, there are flexible roles and tasks which adapt to the concrete circumstances of each family, end quote. This is from Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, Article 175. Consequently, quote, at-home decisions are not made unilaterally, and the two share responsibility for the family, but every home is unique, and every marital synthesis is different, end quotes. That's from Amoris Laetitia 220. Article 124. When instead of a healthy mutual belonging, even though this always requires patience and generosity, signs of irritation and even some disrespect appear in the spouse, it's necessary to react in time before forms of manipulation or violence appear. In these cases, the person must assert his or her dignity, set the necessary limits, and begin a journey of sincere dialogue in such a way to express a clear message, quote, you do not possess me, you do not dominate me, end quotes. This is not only to defend oneself, but also for the dignity of the other, because, quote, in the logic of domination, even those who dominate end up denying their own dignity, end quotes. That's from Amoris Laetitia 155. Article 125. The healthy and beautiful, quote, two of us, end quotes, can only be the reciprocity of two freedoms that are never violated, but choose each other, always leaving a safe limit that cannot be exceeded, that cannot be crossed with the excuse of some need, personal anxiety, or psychological state. As Pope Francis highlights, spouses, quote, are called to an ever more intense union, but the risk lies in trying to erase the differences and that inevitable distance that exists between the two, because each possesses a dignity that is proper and unrepeatable, end quotes. That's from Article 155 of Amoris Laetitia. Fully respecting this principle, quote, requires an interior stripping, end quotes. That's from Article 320. Article 126. Taking what has been said so far seriously, the word belonging, in quotes, can only be applied to marriage in a similar way. Indeed, any form of belonging other than that of love that experiences the other as sacred in their freedom, not transferable to its personal core, and the autonomous, would only be a self-centered way of subjecting the spouse to one's own ends or plans. The person does not disperse the relationship, and the relationship does not merge with the loved one, always remaining an untransferable core. This should not be understood as a limitation or a poverty of mutual love. On the contrary, it allows for the preservation of that level of respect and wonder that are part of every healthy love, which never intends to absorb the other. Article 127. This is confirmed by the fact that there is a dimension of the person which, being the deepest, transcends all others, including the corporeal, in which only God can enter without violating it. There is a core of the human being in which only the infinite love of God can reign. He alone has the omnipotent and creative love which makes the very existence of freedom possible. Therefore, if he touches it, he can only strengthen it, promote it, exalt it in its very nature, without any possibility of mutilating it, dominating it, weakening it, or imposing himself upon it. Indeed, quote, God alone penetrates, elabitor the soul, end quotes. That's from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae
Tertia pars Q64 A1 response, solus Deus illabitur anime. End of footnote. Only God can enter into the depths of the human heart, since only he can do so without disturbing the freedom and identity of the person. Here's referencing Aquinas' De Veritate, Q28 A2 to number 8, and also Summa Contra Gentiles 2, chapter 98, number 18, and also Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 88, number 6, and Bonaventure's Collationes in Hexameron 21:18. End of footnote. God, through grace, draws fully close with an identification with the deepest depths of the human being, which only he can reach. And that's a reference to Bonaventure's Insentences 1, D14, A2, Q2, Ad 2. Also Bonaventure's Opera Theologica Selecta 1, Quaracchi, 1934, 205 to 206. And also question 2 of that work, Fund 4 and 8. End of footnote. Therefore, quote, no one can claim to possess the most personal and secret intimacy of the loved one, end quote. This is from Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, number 320. Article 128. As their love matures, the couple will be able to peacefully understand and accept that the precious mutual belonging that characterizes marriages is not a possession, but leaves open many possibilities. For example, one of the two may request a moment of reflection or some habitual space for solitude or autonomy, or reject the other's intrusion into some aspect of their intimacy, or keep some personal secrets locked away in the sanctum sanctorum of their conscience without being followed or observed. Article 129. When love matures, that we too, in quotes, possesses all the strength of a union freely chosen by both, all the joy of a shared memory, all the satisfaction of a shared journey and dreams, all the security that comes from knowing that one is not and will not be alone. But that beauty is enhanced by magnificent freedom that no true love could harm. Article 130. Marriage, therefore, also excludes any control that might provide security, absolute certainty, the absence of all surprises. In a mature love, if the other needs time to rediscover the world, there is room only for trust, not for the demand of absolute tranquility, free of all secret fears, and capable of facing new challenges. In this sense, marriage is not free as completely from loneliness, because a spouse cannot attain a space that can only be God's, nor feel this personal emptiness that no human being is capable of feeling. The fact that their affection is imperfect does not mean that it is a false, totally selfish, and authentic, but simply that it is earthly, limited, and cannot be expected to satisfy every need. The next section is called Mutual Aid, Article 131. Certainly, this ability to accept the risk of freedom does not mean that a spouse who is very sensitive to defending his or her own space for autonomy will cultivate an indifference to the other's fears, an excessive self-confidence, a demand for complete independence that the limited human heart of his or her own partner, especially if he or she loves him or her, cannot accept without great suffering. He or she cannot feel saved by his or her own autonomous self-sufficiency, because a loving alliance, which I think is also the word a covenant in Italian, also implies the recognition that the other person needs him or her. Article 132. Together with safeguarding a healthy freedom, the Word of God, while approving the request for spaces of autonomy and solitude for a certain period, also demands, quote, do not reject one another, end quotes. That's from 1 Corinthians 7:5. When the distance becomes too frequent, the we, in quotes, is exposed to its own possible eclipse, to the weakening of the other's desire. In any case, if mutual attraction wanes, it's always possible to find space for sincere dialogue to heal what is causing the mutual estrangement. Ultimately, it is always possible to seek alternative paths that consolidate and enrich the we, in quotes, in a new way. This is a healthy but difficult balance which each couple achieves in its own way, through sincere dialogue and mutual offering. Article 133. Mutual belonging becomes mutual help that not only seeks the happiness of the spouse and an alleviation of his or her suffering, but also helps each other to mature as persons, until reaching the ultimate end of life for both before God and at the banquet of heaven. St. Paul VI recalls that, quote, through the mutual personal gift, proper and exclusive to them, spouses tend towards the communion of their persons, by which they perfect each other, end quotes. That's from his encyclical Humanae Vitae, Article 8. Prayer as a couple is certainly a precious means for growing in love, for sanctifying one another, a prayer which, quote, has its original content, family life itself, end quotes. That's from JP2's Familiaris Consortio, Article 59. In this journey of sanctification, says Sertillange, sexuality must not be excluded, lived as a holy expression of a full gift of self to the other, as Christ and his church give themselves to each other. Quote, the act thus performed is therefore not only licit as the effect of a natural and legal institution, not only is it virtuous as useful and directed to useful ends, it is holy with the sanctity of the sacrament of which it is the use, with the sanctity of the sacred union of all humanity with its Redeemer, end quote. That's from Sertillange's Christian Love in Italian, page 97. Article 134. A discussion of monogamy implies the recognition of the fact that the uniqueness of the spouse reflects in the horizontal, in quotes, order of human relationships, the uniqueness of the relationship of the human person with the divine infinite. Thinking about monogamy means questioning the relationship of human love with its ultimate fulfillment. Every loving relationship silently calls for the presence of an infinite third, who is God himself. There's referencing J. L. Marion's The Erotic Phenomenon, 6 Meditations, translated and edited by El Tasso. In a footnote, without this third, capital T, love easily closes in on itself and collapses. Conjugal exclusivity then appears not as a limitation, but as the condition, a possibility of a supernatural love, which beyond the flesh opens itself to the eternal. Indeed, St. Thomas Aquinas teaches that the same, quote, Holy Spirit proceeds invisibly to the soul through the gift of love, end quotes. And that's a reference to Thomas Aquinas' In Sententia 1D15Q4A1 Co. Consequently, in the experience of authentic love, we connect with that infinite, capital L love, which is the Holy Spirit. Precisely the experience of such a close love, like that of marriage, powerfully awakens in the human heart the desire for a love that is not only forever, but without end. Thus, the love of spouses becomes an epiphany of the transcendent and eternal destiny of the human person. For only a love capable of transcending human love, the eternal and infinite love, capital L, can respond to that desire for love forever, in quotes, and without end, in quotes, that conjugal love inspires. And this is why the experience of that particular and profound closeness offered by the conjugal bond is ultimately destined to awaken in the heart of every man and every woman the desire for that unparalleled closeness that only God can offer fully and definitively. And God himself, by becoming man, begins to respond to this desire, also conferring on the closeness born of the marital bond the seal of uniqueness, which is precisely the sign and pledge of God's communion with each of us in a covenant of never-ending love. Consequently, how can we not think of marriage as a path of mutual help to sanctify ourselves together to reach the heights of union with God? Article 135. Mutual help for sanctification, in which the two support each other, quote, in grace, in quotes, that's from Lumen Gentium number 41, is achieved above all in the exercise of conjugal charity, because only charity exercised concretely toward the other allows us to grow in the life of grace. Without charity, any effort at sanctification, quote, would be of no use to me, in quotes. That's from 1 Corinthians 13:3. For this reason, the last pages of this document are dedicated to that unitive power which is conjugal charity. Okay, the section is conjugal charity. It's a larger section. Article 136. We have already discussed the reciprocal nature of the conjugal union, which can be considered a form of intimate and all-encompassing friendship. In this regard, it's useful to remember that St. Thomas himself specifies that friendship is, quote, founded on some commonality, in quotes. This is from his Summa Theologiae Secunda Secundae Q23A1 response. More than some ideological or aesthetic affinities, which can be very important, it's a question of the communion that creates love, which, with its unitive force, makes spouses similar to each other, increases the things they share, creates a treasure of life between the two. Therefore, first of all, it must be said that in order to speak of friendship, there must be love. The first subsection here is a particular form of friendship. Article 137. Marriage cannot be properly understood without speaking of love, which for Christians is always called to reach the heights of charity, a supernatural love which, quote, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, end quotes. This is from 1 Corinthians 13:7. Indeed, quote, the grace proper to the sacrament of matrimony is intended to perfect the love of the spouses, end quote. That's from Catechism, Article 1641. This supernatural love is a divine gift, which is asked for in prayer and nourished in the sacramental life. It invites spouses to remember the fact that God is the principal author of the unity of marriage, and that without his help, their union will never reach its fullness. And the Latin rite of marriage quotes the words of the Lord, quote, what God has joined together, let men unseparate. It's referencing the rite of marriage, number 74 in Italian, page 47. And that's a reference to Matthew 19:6 and Mark 10:9. We note that the conjugal unity is not constituted only by human consent, but it is the work of the Holy Spirit. The same must be said of the growth and communion of spouses, animated by grace and charity. This communion develops as a response to a, quote, vocation from God and is brought about as a filial response to his call, end quotes. That's from John Paul II's Familiaris Consortio, Article 59. But the growth of charity does not occur without human cooperation. In this case, the collaboration of spouses who seek every day an ever more intense, rich, and generous communion. Article 138. Charity, including conjugal charity, is an affective union, meaning that hereby affective, in quotes, something more than feelings and desires. Quote, it implies an affective bond between the one who loves and the thing loved, insofar as the one who loves considers the loved person as one with himself, end quotes. This is from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae Secundae, Q27A2 response. It is expressed in the action of the will. It's from the same place, Secundae, but question 23A2, and has response, love is in itself an act of the will, end quotes, which once chooses someone, decides to enter into intimate communion with him, unites himself to that person freely with all the more or less intense effects that this may imply on the sensitivity in the form of the desire, emotion, sexual attraction, sensuality. Even when these effects on the sensitivity or on the body weaken or are transferred in the various phases of life, the affective union remains, sometimes with great intensity, in the will. It is the will that wants to remain in union with the other human being, appreciating him as of great value, in quotes, referencing the Prima Secundae, question 26A3 response of Aquinas, and constituting with him, quote, one thing with himself, in quotes. This is from the Summa Secundae, Q27A2 response. Article 139. Only in this way is it possible to sustain fidelity in times of adversity or temptation, because charity keeps us attached to a value higher than the satisfaction of personal needs. In this regard, we cannot ignore the many testimonies of couples in which the spouses have supported each other in the various difficulties of life, sometimes during trials lasting years, thus testifying to the prophetic importance of monogamy. This is well expressed in the formula of consent in the Latin rite of marriage. Quote, I promise to be faithful to you always, in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, and to love and honor you all the days of my life, end quote. That's from the Roman ritual rite of marriage again. Conjugal charity itself, with its unitive power, makes it possible for this promise to be truly fulfilled. This affective, faithful, and total union takes the form of friendship in marriage, because ultimately charity is a form of friendship. It's referencing the Secundae Q23A1 of the Summa of Aquinas. And Pope Francis, quoting St. Thomas Aquinas, therefore maintains that, quote, after the love that unites us to God, conjugal love is the greatest friendship, end quotes. And that's the end of that quote. That's from Amores Laetitia 123. And it says, it's citing Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 123, and which is referring to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics 8:12. Into footnote. Article 140. In the Old Testament, there's a peremptory affirmation referring to the need to love. Quote, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, end quotes. That's from Leviticus 19:18. This affirmation comes at the end of a passage in which the obligations of the pious Israelite towards those who are his neighbor, in quotes, are continually recalled. This is a very well-known affirmation since Jesus takes it up and reiterates it. There he's referencing Matthew 22:39, Mark 12:31, and Luke 10:29-37. He thus establishes a very special link between the reality of love, such a universal phenomenon, in the category of neighbor, in quotes. And this way, love itself, when it is authentic, not only is directed towards those who are close to us, but is also capable of generating a closeness, in quotes. It follows that the neighbor, in quotes, is someone with whom a particular sharing of life takes place. In this sense, conjugal love itself reveals and embodies a special closeness, in quotes, which makes the commandment's content resonate with particular conviction. Spousal love, in fact, creates and invokes a unique and singular closeness between two loving hearts, generating a special affinity nourished by such a sharing of a self, of goods, and of life as a whole, that the depth of conjugal love is capable of realizing with unparalleled intensity. As love matures and grows, in marriage the heart of the beloved realizes that no other heart is capable of making it feel at home, in quotes, like that of the person it loves. The next subsection is entitled In Body and Soul. Article 141. This conjugal friendship, filled with mutual knowledge, appreciation of the other, complicity, intimacy, understanding and patience, seeking the good of the other, and sensitive gestures to the extent that it transcends sexuality, at the same time embraces it and gives it its most beautiful, profound, unitive, and fruitful meaning. In this regard, Pope Francis recalls that, quote, God himself created sexuality, which is a marvelous gift, in quotes. This is from Amoris Laetitia, Article 150. At the same time, quote, sexual union lived in a human way and sanctified by the sacrament is in turn for the spouses a path of growth in the life of grace, in quotes. This is from Article 74 of that Amoris Laetitia. Therefore, placing sexuality within the proper framework of a love that unites spouses in a single friendship which seeks the good of the other does not imply a devaluation of sexual pleasure. By directing it towards the gift of self, it is not only enriched but can also be strengthened. St. Thomas Aquinas explains all this very well when he recalls that, quote, nature has linked pleasure to the functions necessary for the life of man, in quotes, and that whoever rejected it, quote, to the point of neglecting what is necessary for the conversation of nature, would commit a sin, thus violating the natural order, and it's precisely this that falls within the vice of insensibility, in quotes. As from the Summa Theologiae Secunda Q142 A1 response. Within this logic, St. Thomas argues that before original sin, sensible pleasure was greater since nature was purer, more whole, and consequently the body was more sensitive. This is the opposite of anxious dissoluteness, which ultimately damages pleasure by depriving it of the possibilities of an authentically human experience. End quote. That's not a quote, that's a reference to the Prima Pars, question 98, A223, and Secunda Secundae, Q153, A222 of Aquinas, is the Summa. The specifically human capacities that allow the human spirit to permeate the senses, to direct them and bring them to completion, quote, do not diminish the pleasure of the senses, end quote, but rather to make it possible in all its fullness and richness, preventing, quote, the concupiscible faculty from adhering unrestrainedly to pleasure, end quotes. It's from the Prima Pars, question 98, A2-23. Living sexuality is an action of the whole human being, and his corporeality and interiority, thanks also to the transferring power of charity, means that it is not lived passively, as a simple letting oneself be carried away by impulses, but is the action of the person who chooses to unite fully with the other. Article 142. Lived in this way, sexuality is no longer the outlet for an immediate need, but a personal choice that expresses the totality of one's person and accepts the other as a personal totality. This truth, rather than compromising the intensity of pleasure, can increase it, making it more intense, richer, and more fulfilling. The mere fact of being treated as a person and of treating the other in the same way can free the heart from traumas, fears, anguish, anxiety, feelings of loneliness, abandonment, and the inability to love, which certainly hinder pleasure. At the same time, the development of love as a human and theological virtue helps to liberate the best of each person in his or her own unique identity. and thus make him or her capable of a greater and more human joy, to the point of giving thanks to God, who created everything, quote, for our enjoyment, end quote. That's from 1 Timothy 6:17. All this does not take away from sexual union that, quote, abundance of pleasure, which is in the sexual act, ordered according to reason, end quotes, and which, quote, does not contradict the means of virtue, end quote. That's from Aquinas' Secunda Secundae, question 153, A2-2. Instead, if one withdraws into oneself and one's immediate needs and uses the other as the only means for their release, the pleasure leaves one more unsatisfied, and the feeling of emptiness and loneliness becomes more bitter. Article 143. Speaking of conjugal charity, Caro invites us to overcome every useless dialectic, explaining that, quote, love virtue refers to effective love as well as to the love of concupiscence, end quotes. That's from Love and Responsibility in Italian, page 89. Pope Benedict XVI in Deus Caritas Est reiterates that oblative love, amor benevolentiae, and possessive love, amor concupiscentiae, cannot be separated from each other because, quote, ultimately, love is a single reality, albeit with different dimensions. From time to time, one or the other dimension can emerge more. Where, however, the two dimensions are completely detached from each other, a caricature, or in any case, a reductive form of love emerges. End quote. That's from Deus Caritas Est, Article 8 of Pope Benedict. When we speak of concupiscence, we must not only mean sexual desire, but also any way of seeking the other as, quote, a good for me, in quotes, to overcome loneliness, to receive help in difficulties, to have a space of total trust, etc. This form of love, which is not excluded in marriage, is a way of expressing that I'm not the savior of the other, not omnipotent and inexhaustible giver of good, but that I am a needy being, that I too need the other, that I too am incomplete and fragile, and that therefore the other is important to me, and I give him the possibility of becoming fruitful by doing good to me. To do otherwise would be a sort of self-sufficiency that can easily be transformed into disguised egocentrism, because Satan, quote, disguises himself as an angel of light, end quote. This is from 2 Corinthians 11:14. Benedict XVI thus explains that, quote, man cannot even live exclusively in self-sacrificing, descending love. He cannot always just give, he must also receive. Whoever wants to give love must himself receive it as a gift, end quote. This is from Deus Caritas Est, Article 7. Article 144. In this sense, we cannot ignore the fact that in recent decades, in the context of postmodern consumerist individualism, various problems have emerged originating from an excessive and uncontrolled pursuit of sex, or from the simple denial of the procreative purpose of sexuality. A characteristic of recent decades is the explicit denial of the unitive purpose of sexuality and of marriage itself. This occurs especially because of the feeling of anxiety, of being constantly busy, of wanting more free time for oneself, of being constantly obsessed with traveling and exploring other realities. Consequently, the desire for emotional exchange, for sexual relations themselves, but also for dialogue and cooperation disappears, all of which are seen as stressful, in quotes. The next subsection is the multifaceted fruitfulness of love. Article 145. An integral vision of conjugal charity does not deny its fruitfulness, the possibility of generating a new life, because, quote, this totality, required by conjugal love, also corresponds to the demands of a responsible fruitfulness, in quotes. That's from Familiaris Consortio, Article 11 of John Paul II. Sexual union as a way of expressing conjugal charity must naturally remain open to the communication of life. There's a reference to Humanae Vitae, Article 11. Even if this does not mean that this must be an explicit aim of every sexual act. In fact, three legitimate situations can arise. A, that a couple cannot have children. Caro explains this magnificently when he recalls that marriage has, quote, an interpersonal structure. It's a union in a community of two persons. For many reasons, marriage may not become a family, but the lack of this does not deprive it of its essential character. In fact, the interior and essential reason for the existence of marriage is not only to transform itself into a family, but above all, to constitute a union of two persons, a lasting union founded on love. A marriage in which there are no children, though through no fault of their spouses, retains the integral value of the institution. It loses none of its importance, end quote. That's from Love and Responsibility in Italian, page 161. B, that a couple does not consciously seek a certain sexual act as a means of procreation. Wojtyła who also says this, maintaining that a conjugal act which, quote, being in itself an act of love that unites two persons, may not necessarily be considered by them as a conscious and desired means of procreation, end quotes. That's from page 173 of the same work. And C, that a couple respect the natural times of infertility. Following this line of reflection, as St. Paul VI states, quote, the Church teaches that it is then licit to take into account the natural rhythms inherent in the generative functions for the use of marriage only in the infertile periods, end quotes. That's from Humanae Vitae, number 16. This can serve not only as to, quote, regulate birth rates, end quotes, but also to choose the most suitable moments to welcome a new life. In the meantime, the couple can exploit these periods, quote, as a manifestation of affection and to safeguard mutual fidelity. In doing so, they give proof of a love that is truly and completely honest, end quotes. That's from Humanae Vitae, Article 16 as well. Article 146. All this shows the important innovation that Pope Pius XI offers when he affirms that conjugal love, quote, pervades all the duties of conjugal life, and in Christian marriage holds the primacy of nobility, end quotes. That's from Casti Connubii 547 to 548. In this way, he helps to overcome the discussion on the relationship between the ends or meanings of marriage, procreative and unitive, and the order that exists between them, placing conjugal charity above these dialectic of ends and goods as the central question of conjugal life, which in turn gives it a multifaceted fruitfulness. Even in the most difficult moments, spouses can say, quote, we're friends, we love each other, we value each other, we have decided to share our entire lives, we belong to each other, and we have freely chosen this union that God himself has blessed and strengthened. If at one time there are no children, we remain united and are fruitful in other ways. If at another time there is no sex, we continue to live this unique, exclusive, and all-encompassing friendship that is also our best path to growth and sanctification, end quotes. Article 147. St. Augustine himself, who so strongly emphasizes the purpose of procreation, teaches that marriage in itself is a good even if there are no children, quote, because it establishes a natural partnership between the two sexes. Otherwise, it would not continue to be called marriage, even in old people, especially when they have lost their children or have had none at all, end quotes. This is from Augustine's On the Good of Conjugal Love, 3:3. A similar position expressed in other words is supported by St. John Chrysostom, quote, what then is to be said? If there is no child, then the spouses will no longer be two? It is evident their journeying, mixis, in fact, does just this. It pours and mixes together the bodies of both. And as he who has poured perfume into oil makes the whole one, so also here, end quotes. That's from John Chrysostom's homily on the Epistle to the Colossians, homily 12, chapter 5. In essence, this is also affirmed by the Second Vatican Council, quote, even if the offspring, often so keenly desired, do not arise, marriage endures as a custom and communion of the whole of life and retains its value, end quote. That's from Gaudium Spes, Article 50. Article 148. One author illustrates well that beyond the objectives, in quotes, the spouses may set for themselves, which do not constitute the essence of marriage, quote, the unity that marriage entails is explained and justified in itself, with priority given into its teleological tension, because it is a unity that possesses in itself its own and complete reason for good, from which certain proper works derive, without a doubt, but as consequences, never as causes, end quote. That's from Viladrich's Conjugal Love and the Essence of Marriage, Jus Canonicum 12, 311. On this unity, which belongs to the essence of marriage, conjugal charity is the principal and most perfect moral and spiritual expression that gives marriage various forms of fruitfulness. The next subsection is a friendship open to all. Article 149. From what has been said, it follows that an exclusive union generated and sustained by true love, even if still immature and fragile, cannot be closed in on itself. It is not an extension of individualism in the life of a couple, but is open to other relationships. It's disposed to the couple's self-giving and to shared projects to do something beautiful for the community and for the world. Article 150. If marriage is already in itself a framework for a relationship which matures both spouses, this is even more true when it is generously open to others, thus overcoming, quote, the original tragic closure of man within himself, end quote. That's from Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate, Article 53, which leads to the thought that by isolating himself, a person is freer and happier. Because, quote, the human creature, in as far as he is spiritual by nature, finds fulfillment in interpersonal relationships. The more authentically he lives them, the more his own personal identity also matures. It's not by isolating himself that man fulfills himself, but by placing himself in a relationship with others and with God, in quotes. That's from Caritas in Veritate 53 as well. Article 151. As Pope Francis teaches in his appeal for universal brotherhood in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, charity is called to an intensive, but also extensive growth, which, quote, tends to embrace everyone, in quotes. That's from Fratelli Tutti, number 60. Charity, therefore, impels us to broaden the conjugal we. Quote, I cannot reduce my life to relationships with a small group, or even to my family, because it's impossible to understand myself without a broader fabric of relationships. The bond of a couple and of friendship is designed to open our hearts to others, to enable us to go beyond ourselves, to welcome everyone. Closed groups and self-referential couples, which constitute themselves as a we, opposed to the entire world, are usually idealized forms of selfishness and mere self-protection, in quotes. That's from Article 89 of Fratelli Tutti. Article 152. The risk of endogamy, that is, of a closed we, contradicts the very nature of charity and can mortally wound it. 4 factors can prevent this endogamy, which distorts and impoverishes the meaning of the conjugal union. A. The spaces each spouse enjoys through work, personal endeavors, and learning and development, opportunities outside of marriage. If one spouse is unemployed, it becomes necessary to create these spaces for the benefit of the marriage, enriching dialogue and the relationship in general. B. The procreative meaning of marriage, which manifests the fruitfulness of love that is not closed to the communication of life. For those unable to have children, adoption or other forms of stable support for the children of other couples can be a way to realize this fruitfulness. C. Time spent with other married friends, during which, while learning from each other's experiences and receiving support, there's a constant willingness to lend a hand in difficult times, while at the same time helping the couple to become aware of themselves as a union through friendship with other couples. D. The social sense of the couple who, faithful to the social dimension of Christian life, seeks ways to render a service to society and the church, committing themselves together to the search for the common good. Quote, even the family, with many good children, is called to leave its mark on the society in which it is inserted, to develop other forms of fruitfulness which are like the extension of the love which sustains it. It does not remain waiting, but goes out of itself in search of solidarity, in quotes. That's from Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis 181. Quote, social love, a reflection of the Trinity, is in reality what unifies the spiritual sense of the family and its mission outside itself, in quotes. That's from Amoris Laetitia 324. Article 153. A particular proof of the openness of the couple's friendship towards others and of the fruitfulness of their charity is shown in their attention to the poor. Indeed, as Pope Leo XIV recalls, quote, the Christian cannot consider the poor only as a social problem. They're a family question, in quotes. They are, quote, one of us, in quotes. That's from Leo XIV's De Lexite, his exhortation, page 104, or Article 104. Furthermore, quote, love for those who are poor, in whatever form this poverty manifests itself, is the evangelical guarantee of a church faithful to the heart of God, in quotes. That's from Article 103. This fact is reflected in one of the options for the final blessing in the Latin rite for marriage, which concludes with the prayer, quote, be witnesses of God's love in the world, so that the poor and the suffering who have experienced your charity may one day gratefully welcome you into the house of the Father, end quotes. That's from Roman Rituals, Rite of Marriage, page 62 in Italian. This is the final part 7, conclusion. Article 154. Ultimately, although each spousal union is a unique reality embodied within human limitations, every authentic marriage is a unity composed of 2 individuals requiring a relationship so intimate and all-encompassing that it can only be shared with others. At the same time, since it's a union between 2 persons who have exactly the same dignity and the same rights, it demands that exclusivity which prevents the other from being relativized in his or her unique value and used merely as a means among others for the satisfaction of needs. This is the truth of monogamy that the Church reads in Scripture, which he affirms that from two they become one flesh, in quotes. It's the first essential and inalienable characteristic of that very particular friendship which is marriage, and which requires as its existential manifestation an all-encompassing relationship, spiritual and corporeal, which matures and grows ever more towards a union that reflects the beauty of Trinitarian communion and the union between Christ and his beloved people. This occurs to such an extent that we can recognize, quote, in the intimate conjugal union through which two people become one heart, one soul, one flesh, the first original meaning of marriage, in quotes. That's from Dietrich von Hildebrand's Marriage, translated and edited by B. Manino, page 33. Article 155. The path followed in this note now allows us to highlight a development of Christian thought on marriage from antiquity to the present day, where it is evident that of its two essential properties, unity and dissolubility, unity is the founding property. On the one hand, because dissolubility derives as a characteristic of a unique and exclusive union. On the other, because union, accepted and lived with all its consequences, makes possible that permanent infidelity that indissolubility demands. Indeed, various magisterial documents have described the marital union simply as an indissoluble unity, in quotes. That's from the Council of Trent, session number 24, November 11, 1563, the Doctrine on the Sacrament of Matrimony. It's also referencing Gaudium et Spes, Article 48, and the Catechism, paragraph 1641. Article 156. This union requires a constant growth of love. Marital love is not safeguarded primarily by speaking of indissolubility as if it were an obligation or by repeating a doctrine, but by strengthening it through constant growth under the impulse of grace. Love that does not grow begins to run risks, and we can grow only by responding to divine grace through more acts of love, with more frequent, more intense, more generous, more tender, more joyful acts of affection, in quotes. As from Mors Laetitia 134. Marital unity is not only a reality that must be better understood in its most beautiful sense, but also a dynamic reality called to continuous development. As the Second Vatican Council affirms, husband and wife, quote, experience the sense of their own unity and achieve it ever more fully, in quotes. That's from Gaudium et Spes, Article 48. For, quote, the best is that which has not been achieved, the wine matured with time, in quotes. That's from M. Mors Laetitia, Article 135. And then here's a subnote, a note at the very end. The Supreme Pontiff Leo XIV and the audience granted to the undersigned Prefect, together with the Secretary for the Doctrinal Section of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, on November 21st, 2025, liturgical memorial of the presentation of the Blessed Mary, approved by this note, deliberated in the ordinary session of this Dicastery on November 19th, 2025, and ordered its publication. Given in Rome at the seat of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith on November 25th, 2025, signed Víctor Manuel Cardinal Fernández, Prefect, Monsignor Armando Matteo, Secretary for the Doctrinal Section, and has ex Audientia Die, November 21st, 2025, Leo pp. 14.